hate that aspect. I really do. Okay. Welcome, everybody. I'm just bringing up the chat for everybody. So we are going to be live doing this just to see if it works out. If not, then I'll stop doing it. Because I hate all of you. Yes, I hate all of the people who watch our podcast. That's exactly what it is. No. Okay. Let me just dig out the chat from this one, too. See, what's funny is that also a few friends of mine who saw what we were doing on Twitter are probably like, oh, he made the podcast. Because I got told by quite a few people, like, you're doing it again. You're doing it again. You better stop. And thankfully, that's not the case. So I'm happy about that. I promise.
Yeah.
I promise everybody, there's no trouble in paradise. At least not yet. I mean, I could say something bad about Fire Emblem, then he'll walk out. But
Nah, because unlike most nerds, I don't take criticisms of the things I like personally because I don't wrap my entire identity around them. That's one thing about
good.
That's one thing about fandom that I've just never understood. Where yeah, people may not like things you like, but that's. I mean, I'll still enjoy the things I enjoy. It's not like them criticizing it is going to make me enjoy it any less. And
Well,
sometimes the criticisms are quite valid. I mean, for example, there are some people who had problems with the way it told its story. Granted, it's definitely better than Fates. Like, Fates, everybody's kind of come to the agreement of, yeah, Fates was a bit of a dumpster fire.
I'll take your word for it. I keep getting recommended to watch it. But then I get occasional stuff like that, where it's just like, okay, it's probably not worth it. And then I'm like, well, maybe I ought to go looking at something else like JoJo, because, you know, Romney's been waiting forever for that one.
Well,
And
yes,
They
no, I mean,
franchised, right?
yeah, I mean, with JoJo, though, I'm already behind. I haven't even watched Golden Wind, so I'm already well behind, and especially given that there's no confirmation that David Production is going to be doing Stone Ocean. I mean, people want it, but so far we've heard nothing from Shueisha or Lucky Land or Araki at all. Especially considering the content of Stone Ocean, I'm just wondering how the hell are they going to get this to air on prime time in Japan? Because there's some real messed up stuff in Stone Ocean.
I've been asking that question of many anime for many years, and yet somehow they find a way. So
Yeah.
all right, so really quick, I know that we are brand spanking new on Sunday for people. We are running a little late, actually. I think from here on in, we are going to be pushing for like a 5 o'clock Eastern time to do this. That way, because I'm also having to work things out with Alex to record and things like that. But this is basically what to plan for from here on in. If it doesn't work, I'm sorry, but that's why the live stream is there. So you guys can check it out, or you guys can check out the RSS feed. So I'm just pointing that out for the record. And we already did the sync, right?
Yep.
Okay, cool. So let's go ahead and get this show on the road, shall we? Because that's what all the people came here to see, all the lovely people. Greetings once again, my friends, and welcome back to Geek News, Reviews, and Opinions, the podcast where we talk the week's events in Geek for Sunday afternoon, November 8th, 2020. What is wrong with all of us today? We're not meeting on the right day, but yet we are here nonetheless. I'm your host, Adam Mickelson, aka Drac. I hope everybody's having an awesome week. And this is actually just kind of the start of I don't want to call it a new era of the podcast, but basically we are all working and it's the holidays. And so at that point, this is kind of the time where we can all get together and discuss the week's events in Geek. How appropriate too, because we're basically discussing the week's events at the end of the week so that everybody can run into a whole new week of insanity. So that's probably for the best.
Yeah, I mean, especially in the year of 2020, where each week feels like 3 months.
I'm thoroughly convinced. You know, it's snowing outside. I'm kind of surprised the snow isn't on fire yet. And that was actually the person you just barely heard is one of my panel of fellow geeks, fellow YouTubers, fellow awesome guys in general. If you guys aren't following their content, what the hell is wrong with you? You should be, damn it. And you know what you did. And that is Stephen Romney of Studio Ghost Utah, of From the Shelf, Rhapsody in Cinema, Martial March, Monster Clash, all the fun stuff that he loves to do. Romney, you look like you've had a rough night, at least a little bit.
Well, again, working at a news station in the year 2020 has definitely posed a number of challenges.
Well, and you're
And
working on
so,
Sundays too, right?
it's been on and off,
Okay.
mostly because sometimes they have me work Sundays, sometimes they don't. It just really depends on when I'm needed. And so it's been a case where, yeah, if I don't necessarily look the greatest, it's because, well, being at a news station in 2020 during the election, it's had a lot of.
That was actually going to be my next question to you. How much actual sleep did you get?
Well, enough to not crash my car at the very least. Although it didn't help that yesterday my tire blew out and I had to spend a couple hours at a Big O Tires.
Jeez. I love those moments. They're so great. And,
Yeah, like,
and
it was.
Big O always puts on the best things on TV.
Yeah, it was one of those things where yesterday I'm just like, oh, well, of course this happens in 2020, but luckily a couple that lived in the house that I had pulled in front of, they helped me put the spare on, and I was within driving distance of where I got my tires, so I was able to just like, okay, I'll just drive it there, have them fix it, redo the alignment, so that way I don't risk, having my car break down even further, because
Yeah.
I just barely paid off the last payment on that thing. If it were to break down to the point of not being salvageable, I would probably cry.
Yeah, this previous week was nuts for you, if you think about it. Like, you had to cover a lot of this, and it's still not even over yet. So at that point, like, I get that the media is calling already, but in all honesty, I'm getting that 2000 vibe that this is going to go on for 2 months. So
yeah. Plus, the key thing to remember is that what the media is reporting, it's not the official declaration. These are projections. It's a better example is that it's kind of like a weather forecast for the election based on, but the results won't be finalized until December 1st. That is the deadline for all the county clerks throughout the nation to finally finalize the results. But that's why they have it go from the start of November to the start of December, so that way things like recounts and stuff like that can be taken care of. But
which means
so
basically
for
the
those
rest
of you who are wondering about like,
sorry, you got cut off a little bit, but like just to give an example, like the next month for you, it's like you're not in retail or anything like that, but this year is especially going to be busy for you because you have to cover all that. All the recounts, all the little hiccups, all of that has to be covered by you. Or at least by like you helping out in that process. So it's not going to be fun.
Challenges. Yeah, and that's not even getting into the stuff that we usually also try to do for the holidays, which is like arranging musical guests or having to like cover like product stuff like that, as well as, the occasional things like house fires or police incidents. Again, the news is a much more complicated industry than shows like the newsroom make it out to be.
Yeah, no kidding. But I see that our live chat is here to at least give you some support. Welcome, live chat. It would be nice if they had a couch at places where you have long hours at work. The problem is that they probably took out all the beds and couches for extra tables to review data.
Well, again, luckily the data at the station that I work at, we don't actually do it in-house. I mean, Granted, we're still pulling some information from the local races, but basically our election tabulation has been outsourced by another news agency that our station has an outstanding agreement with. I'm not going to say which specific news agency we're licensed through because that'll reveal where I work.
Exactly. And then we also have Alex the Shadow Blazer, who thankfully has not had to deal with the election. At least I'm hoping he hasn't had to deal with the election because he's working retail, and it would be really awkward if he had to manage those polling stations at his job. So, Alex, how are you doing?
Yeah, thankfully we don't have polling stations where I work. Those are usually in public buildings like schools, city halls, and whatnot. So
I'm only saying that it would be bad because of some of the horror stories that he's told on this podcast of some of the people that come into his store. I can only imagine what they'd be doing to a polling station.
We definitely get weird customers, I will say that.
Yes.
We have had an uptick in shoplifting lately, a lot of uptick in theft, so that's a problem we're all having to deal with, and we're still very short-handed going into the holiday season. It's like people will apply, and then they'll arrange an interview, but then they'll just either cancel or not bother to show up for the interview. So, I don't know what to tell you.
Well, See, you guys are all telling work stories. I might as well at least tell this one because I've been kind of hinting at it. I had a bit of a jackass.
Yeah, you didn't tell me today.
Yes, I had a bit of a jackass week for my first week in my new job. To put it simply, okay, my first day, I wrecked my van. Not like totaled. I didn't total it. But basically what happened was I was so worried about what my employers were going to think of me that I was still kind of adjusting to how big this van was. It's actually been a couple of years since I've driven anything near that length. And on my way out of the warehouse to go do my deliveries, I misjudged the ramps that they actually have and the guidelines for it so that we're all going a straight line. And I started turning right, and I dinged my van into one of the guardrails. And yeah, it was very clear that I had done that. And yeah, thankfully my boss was not too mad at me. But it was just one of those things of he had to kind of sit there and lecture me and go, okay, this is longer than you think, and you need to get this out of your head so you can go and deliver packages. And I was like, I'm trying, man. I'm trying. And then what made it even worse was, unfortunately, my daughter didn't get the memo that I was starting a new job this week and decided to bring home a stomach bug from school, which, appropriately enough, I'm taking care of her on the days that my wife has to work. So that meant I got it, which meant I had to miss 2 shifts of my work week because I was sick with the same stomach bug. So I'm just saying right here and now, I probably look like the biggest jackass to my employers right now. I'm just saying that probably for the record. I will do better next time, but I've just, like, Andrea has gotten so mad at me this week. She's like, would you just shut up about it? Would you just shut up? Like, they're not going to get too mad at you. They understand that crap happens. I'm so bad. So, yeah, it's been a fun week for all of us, I think.
Indeed, and a good reminder for everybody, if you can, get your flu shot.
Indeed. Actually, that's part of the other problem we had this week. We got both of our daughter's flu shots all in one day. Don't do it. Well, do it. Do it because then you don't have to worry about it later, but don't do it. Not unless you actually have them in, like, the Hannibal Lecter dolly so you can reel them out, because they will give you hell the entire time. But, like I said, we're on a little bit of a deadline, so let's go ahead and get into the week's events in Geek, as well as a big discussion topic that we have, because you guys have been reaching out to us all of 2020 about various changes that are happening in the entertainment, media, and even gaming industry to see how things are going to change, given aspects like COVID, given aspects like just random crap that's happening in 2020. So at that point, let's go ahead and get into our first story here, which unfortunately looks like Alex's internet just crapped out, and he was supposed to cover it. So yeah, we're gonna talk about this really quick, and we'll let him kind of go over the details when he gets back. But yeah, you guys wanted us all to talk about this. Sony's moving to acquire Crunchyroll. Now, I believe what they're actually, correct me if I'm wrong, Romney, I think they're trying to acquire Otter Media overall, aren't they?
Well, looking here, especially from the Anime News Network, let's see. Yeah, it looks like what it is that AT&T is offering Crunchyroll to Sony to the tune of $1.5 billion,
yeah,
which Sony then basically balked at because of the price. And so, look like it's specifically Crunchyroll. So what is specifically like Sony is specifically eyeing Crunchyroll, and that AT&T is the one who initiated the offer initially, leading to the various negotiations regarding how much Sony would be willing to pay for it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, you kind of cut out there a little bit, but you covered all the details that we needed to cover here. So, yeah, they offered a very big price, which Sony was not happy about. I don't know if this is where you kind of got cut out. I don't think they've offered a lower price at this point, have they?
Well, looking at the article here, it looks like that the asking price was lowered down to $1 billion. But again,
$1 billion. Okay.
Mostly rumor, according to Variety. But the exact figures are still not yet known. This is just based on insider information. The And then the Nikkei, which is kind of the Asian equivalent of the stock exchange. Again, not a one-to-one comparison, but that's kind of the best way to compare it. The Nikkei is reporting that Sony could spend up more than 100 billion yen, which in U.S. currency would be $957 million, so almost $1 billion, to acquire Crunchyroll. And that seems to be what is going on, is that they're in the final stages of making that acquisition official. Granted, it's still rumor. There hasn't been any official statement by either company on whether or not this is actually going through. This is just Nikkei saying, hey, there's this transaction that we're monitoring that may be going through in the near future.
Yeah, and one of the things that is getting brought up, especially in light of this, when people suggested this story, is I hate to say it in any other way, but Sony's basically looking to acquire the anime industry. Because they're probably only missing like one or two companies at this point, and then they've got full monopoly on it.
Well, I guess to better clarify, it wouldn't necessarily be that they're trying to monopolize the entire anime industry, but specifically trying to monopolize international anime distribution would probably be the better way to look at it. Since the anime,
because they've already got that.
Yeah, since the anime companies in Japan will still basically, do their own thing, whereas Crunchyroll, given that it operates in multiple countries outside of Japan, that seems to be the angle Sony is more going for, is trying to basically monopolize international anime distribution and specifically anime streaming, especially in the face of companies like Netflix getting into the anime production arena, as well as a few other companies also throwing their hat in the ring to varying degrees of success.
Because we've actually been seeing a lot of uptick when it came to organizations like Netflix, even Amazon Prime to an extent is starting to acquire more anime. I actually specifically saw that Prime is working out a deal with I believe Retro Crush to try and get their stuff too, to be able to help work those out together. Because it's just being offered through since they've re-tiered into their Prime Video service, which is cheaper. So at that point, like, we're seeing a lot of people doing a cash grab towards the streaming services as well as to anime, because I think it's safe to say at this point, a good portion of that audience watch anime to some extent, especially internationally.
Indeed, especially when you consider the success of certain shows. I mean, of course, you've got shows like Dragon Ball Super and Z that kind of opened the door, but then when you consider the popularity of more mainstream shows like Sword Art Online, as well as a few of the other up-and-coming series like Demon Slayer, My Hero Academia, so on and so forth, it shows that, hey, this is a very lucrative market, and Netflix is approaching it in a different way of thinking, okay, well, let's bankroll our own shows rather than trying to license ones that are already airing, because after the backlash with Little Witch Academia, they realized, hey, this is, kind of a pain in the butt. Let's just finance our own shows and, release it on our own terms, which, again, has had varying degrees of success, depending on who you ask and depending on what shows you're looking at, especially given that they've also been trying to create what I like to call Western anime. This would be shows like Castlevania, Dragon's Dogma, as well as I think most recently Blood of Zeus is probably the most recent one.
Yeah, and I think we're still expecting the Devil May Cry series from Adi Shankar too, as well.
Yep, as well as a few other shows that they've been brokering deals with companies like Skybound and Image to adapt into various media, which, again, Amazon themselves have also been brokering, because I know Amazon Prime did the adaptation of Super Dinosaur, which is another Robert Kirkman property. Yeah. And so, to kind of get back on point, Sony is basically looking to try to control a majority share of anime distribution in the West, and specifically streaming, which has basically become the cash cow. And I know, and I'm not alone in saying this, but honestly, this acquisition has me concerned. Greatly concerned.
Yes. You're not the only one, because I looked at the international distribution aspect of this, just because I get that a lot of organizations are going towards they want to own anime, but already the distribution aspect was kind of concerning to me, because I don't like the idea of one company handling all of the distribution. Because then at that point, if there's only one company running the distribution, things don't necessarily have to change or improve due to competition, and so things could actually technically get worse under Sony.
Yeah, especially when you consider some of the localization missteps and very, very questionable decisions taken by another Sony-owned anime distributor, Funimation. Yeah. I mean, the most famous example being Ms. Kobayashi's Dragon Maid, but there have been more and more shows where even the subtitle translations have been of questionable quality because of a misguided attempt to try to make it more relevant to Western audiences that aren't really part of the major demographic, which to me, I find baffling. I mean, I can understand trying to do that with shows that have that mainstream appeal, like Attack on Titan and My Hero Academia.
Yeah.
To a point. But when you're doing it with shows that are tailoring to a very specific niche, like Kobayashi's Dragon Maid, like Interspecies Reviewers, and a lot of these other shows that are more risque, I look at this and I'm just like, you're clearly not understanding the target demographic for these shows, and you're trying to basically head off criticisms that were never made against these shows in the first place. And considering that Sony is very much the one, I mean, this isn't limited just to Funimation, considering that Sony has also been very much pushing for censorship of their video games. If Sony acquires Crunchyroll, I worry they're going to try to enact a lot of the same policies and practices onto Crunchyroll that we are already seeing with Funimation.
Yeah, we're already seeing like a bunch of stuff from our live chat of concerns of trying to implement various practices, whether it be from distribution rights to Funimation's dubbing, things like that. The other thing that I also want to bring up, because this was specifically asked by a listener and I didn't know the answer, because like every time I think I know this, you guys kind of prove me wrong, and I'm glad Alex is back because he can kind of help out with this. Simulcasting. So a lot of people are also worried that this is going to affect overall simulcasting because Sony would basically gain the rights to all of simulcasting, because of what Crunchyroll has. And I don't know if that's necessarily the case, but it would be kind of worrying if they had to run through Sony corporate to get these things done, because I don't see Sony being forthright as much as Crunchyroll has with, like, if you can get a dub available to be able to simulcast with those. Because I think that's happened, right? Where you've had English sub, but you've also had English dub going on at the same time in the simulcast.
Yeah, but a large part of that usually comes from outstanding agreements. Attack on Titan is a good example, where the deal that was in place was brokered back when Funimation and Crunchyroll were working together before the Sony acquisition, where they had the general agreement of, hey, Crunchyroll will simulcast it subtitled, and then Funimation will produce a broadcast dub that will go live 3 days after the episode airs on Crunchyroll, which Crunchyroll usually uploads the episodes usually within the day of it airing in Japan. And so a lot of those agreements, especially if they're already outstanding agreements in place between Crunchyroll and Funimation, that's why, even though they're no longer working together, that's why you'll still see the Funimation and Crunchyroll logos on shows like My Hero Academia and Attack on Titan, because those agreements are still in place. As for Sony controlling the whole thing, yeah, that is very concerning, but again, it comes down to whether or not the companies like Funimation or Crunchyroll are part of the initial planning committees behind these shows, or if they're having to license them, and whether or not the company producing and distributing the show in Japan is willing to agree to the terms that Sony sets forth. Which, granted, for companies that are investing a lot of money in producing an anime series, having that massive distribution would be helpful, but Sony is not the only game in town. This is why JoJo is distributed by Viz, same case with One Punch Man, where rather than going through a lot of the major players like Funimation, they instead went to Viz, which kind of does its own thing, especially given that with JoJo especially, JoJo's Bizarre Adventure has to go through an extra layer of translation and localization because, you know, Araki really, really loves making musical references, and American musicians and musical acts are very, very litigious.
Jeez, I can't even begin to wow, I just had a really twisted thought in my head that I kind of need to share. Like, JoJo, man, would that even ever get to the States if Sony was in charge? Like, Sony Music would basically take over the series.
Yeah, it's tricky because it would be a case where, and again, if Sony were to, firstly, I doubt Araki would actually agree to give it to Sony because of the fact that a lot of the musical acts he references are actually under Warner Brothers music. That's why you have the ending themes of the JoJo series using Western music like Roundabout by Yes, or Walk Like an Egyptian by the Bangles, or I Want You, I Need You by Savage Garden.
Didn't he also reference like Michael and Beatles and things like that?
Oh, it goes across the board, the kind of musical acts he's referencing. But because Warner Brothers Japan is the company that is helping to produce the JoJo anime, they have rights. They have the licensing rights to all of the music catalog of Warner Brothers Music, and so that kind of mitigates some of it. Whereas Sony's music distribution, doesn't have the kind of library that would gel well with JoJo, and so that would be something that Sony themselves would run into, especially considering that they would effectively be having to work with Warner Brothers in order to bring it to the US if they had the rights. But because Warner Brothers tried to do it themselves, dropped the ball, and then handed it off to Viz, that's why Viz is the major distributor. And so in terms of how it would affect the simulcasting agreements with shows that Sony would be able to license, again, it would be concerning considering that they would be doing both simuldub and simul-sub. But because of the fact that it would really come down to whether or not the company producing the anime would agree to Sony's terms, that's really going to be what is going to make or break it. Some companies like Toei and maybe Toho would be a bit more inclined to work with Sony because of the established infrastructure. But there are other anime companies that maybe they don't necessarily trust Sony. They may want to go with a different route. And so, again, case in point, if it's a show produced by Warner Brothers Japan, they're not going to necessarily want to distribute through Sony because Sony is a direct competitor. But likewise, if it's a company that, say, has an outstanding agreement with the likes of Bandai Namco, they'd be more inclined because Bandai Namco has a very good relationship with Sony, particularly because of series like Tekken and Soul Calibur.
Oh, that's true. Okay. Alex, I kind of want to bring this question to you as well, but feel free, Romney, to interject here. Because I know, like, you and me talk a lot of the more mainstream anime, but this is a concern that a listener brought directly to Alex, being that he is the hipster of the podcast. Does this pretty much nuke the possibility of bringing unique, up-and-coming indie darlings in the anime scene because Sony's never going to want to procure them? Sony's only ever going to want to procure what's popular, what's marketable, things like that. And so, where shonens will have no issue with it, relationship anime, slice of life anime might get the shaft when it comes to Sony's discussion of what they want to pick up and what they want to dub and everything like that. Is there a legit worry to that? Is that something that has to be considered? Is that smaller, more darling artistic shows are no longer going to be considered for simulcast, or not simulcast, but for dubbing over or being able to get any kind of rights distributed over to the US?
I'm not as concerned about that because at this point, the digital market has opened up, I think, way more than for shows like that than one that we ever had in the early days of even the VHS market, the DVD market, or just the plain Blu-ray market.
Yeah, and I can only talk about like one major market in that regard when it came to Japan. Like, I do follow a lot of pro wrestling, and I love the accessibility of New Japan Pro World. Being able, like, I can watch Wrestle Kingdom in the comfort of my own home. I don't have to go to Tokyo anymore to do that. And so, like, I know that aspect, but I don't know necessarily how that would work from an anime perspective, or even in the cases of another thing that this person brought up, like the dramas that are being brought over and I believe dubbed by Funimation, like live action dramas.
I don't think Funimation's dubbing any live action dramas. There might be one or two.
I know they have some in their. I know they have some on their streaming service, but I'm not sure if they're dubbed.
They've done some subtitled distribution of certain live action shows and movies in the past. It really depends on if there's enough of a demand for a dub. I mean, for example, there was one live action drama series they distributed that I watched during the simulcast called Moyashimon that they never really bothered to dub because it was a very niche series. But if you look at the live action Kenshin films, because of the fact that Kenshin is an established brand, again, barring, all the usual asterisks regarding Nobuhiro Watsuki, a live action movie like the Kenshin trilogy is going to probably get more of the attention and actually get a dub as opposed to the more niche stuff like Moyashimon. And so they have distributed some live action stuff, and they've even done dubs of live action films from other countries like Korea. I remember there was a brief period of time where they were bringing over a lot of Korean movies that were dubbed, and especially given that Okratron themselves, Chris Sabat's dubbing studio, also is frequently brought in to dub a lot of foreign live action Asian films. And so it's one of those cases where they've done it a little bit. It really just depends on if the series itself warrants it. It's just doing a dub of a live action show carries a whole separate set of risks and challenges. It's kind of one of the reasons why Ultraman never got a foothold here in the States.
Mm-hmm. So at that point, Alex, what you're basically saying is that we don't have to worry about that. They'll still find a way to digitally distribute some of these more niche series.
Yeah, I mean, so the studios under Sony's umbrella in Japan produce slice of life anime that have
Okay.
become major hits, or some that have, or just get enough views, I suppose. I don't see why all of a sudden, because Funimation's also rather Sony is gonna own Crunchyroll, that means we're suddenly not gonna get any like slice of life. I'm pretty confident that we're still gonna get slice of life, even if it's not on Crunchyroll. Well, there's still Sentai Filmworks out there. There's
Yeah.
still
Yep,
Netflix out there.
If
Netflix,
anything,
Nozomi Entertainment.
yeah, like Viz could take over for that and make it kind of their primary one.
Yeah, it
Yeah.
kind of really. Yeah, I guess it would really depend on the show and if it has enough of a demand. Because I know companies like Discotech have stepped in with shows that most people would consider really niche, and even Nozomi Entertainment. A good example is the Kickstarter that Nozomi launched for shows like Aria, as well as most recently dubbing the show Emma, which is an animated period drama that you'd think would probably find a really good audience here if it was aired alongside, Masterpiece Theater and stuff like that. And so there's that demand is still going to be there. And I know Aniplex themselves have produced some of those more niche shows that people want to consume. And so it would be foolhardy if Sony just suddenly went, oh, we're not going to care about these shows. Like, hey, they want to pay for it. If they'll just settle for a sub, we'll do the subs. If there's enough of a demand for the show, we'll do a dub. It's just good business sense.
Okay, and this one I want to aim at both of you because you will be able to answer it better than me. I know that Viz and Crunchyroll are lumped into the Warner Brothers umbrella. They're part of it. But this was a question that I couldn't answer. Doesn't it mean by default that if they bought Crunchyroll, they would also buy Viz? I don't think they would, because that would make about as much sense as lumping in Rooster Teeth in there.
Yeah, that's not really.
Viz is its own company.
Yeah, Viz is its own company, and AT&T, the company that owns Crunchyroll is what they are offering. They're not offering any of the others. I'm sure Sony probably made some sort of a counter offer to try to acquire some of the other stuff. And so the other thing to consider is that they may be selling the Crunchyroll as in the streaming service and the company that provides it. But that also raises the question, was that going to include Elation Studios, the company that is producing a lot of the original adaptations, such as Tower of God and a lot of the other original animes like, High Guardian Spice, which nobody's really heard hide nor hair of because it's since been overshadowed by all of the webtoon adaptations. But again, Crunchyroll is what is on the offering block. That's what AT&T said, hey, Sony, you want to buy this for about $1 billion? And so Viz is completely separate from it. And considering that a lot of the show's Viz licenses, there have been some that had simulcast agreements on Crunchyroll, but that's not because they cut the deal with Viz. That's because Crunchyroll cut the deal with the studios in Japan that were creating the shows in Japan, with Viz picking up the home video rights, which people kind of forget. The rights to stream and the rights to distribute it on DVD and Blu-ray for the home video market, they're not always the same. What one company may allow for one company to stream, they may go to a completely different company for home video, as we've seen with JoJo and One Punch Man. They let Crunchyroll stream it, but then they went to a different company. And that's kind of the key thing here, is that what it looks like Sony is more focused on securing international streaming of anime with the acquisition of Crunchyroll, but that may not necessarily mean that they're gonna own all of it, because there's still the home video market with the likes of Sentai, Nozomi, Viz, and a lot of these other companies that are still catering to these niches that honestly most of the major players have kind of ignored within the past decade or so with anime releases. I mean, even companies like Shout Factory and G-Kids have been stepping up to pick up shows that most people pass over. I mean, we probably wouldn't get Digimon if it wasn't for companies like Shout Factory and Saban. And that's another factor. Saban is still also in the anime distribution game. They've just scaled things back.
All right. And okay, so while we've been having this discussion, and I value it, holy crap, the chat has been going kind of crazy. So at that point, I kind of want to address some of the things that they're talking about because, they're here and I want to get them involved here. So let's just go ahead and go from the top, so to speak. RPX is asking, will they change the name from Crunchyroll to Cinnamon Roll? That would be hilarious.
And that would be hilarious. But that would kind of go against the reference because the name Crunchyroll is specifically in reference to a type of sushi roll. So unless there's a very obscure, sweet-tasting type of sushi called a cinnamon roll, which if there is, I kind of want to try it to see just how that would work. I mean, I could see it working, especially if you marinate the fish in like mirin or something, which naturally tastes a little bit sweet. Or I can even see that working with something like tamagoyaki, where you mix it with mirin, and then maybe as you're folding the egg, you put the cinnamon in. But yeah, just.
All right, so we also have Kasaibo saying if Sony does dominate Japanese animation, they better improve studio working conditions. Not likely.
Unfortunately, that's a whole nother issue than what we're talking about. We're talking about the international distribution rights and versus the current production models that Japan and
the reason I want to bring it up is because it's Sony. Sony ain't doing nothing.
No, not unless it's something that would, not unless such outrage against not doing anything would cut into their bottom line, because sadly, that's the way it works. The company only cares if it actually affects the bottom line.
Yep. So then we also have a question of will they bring back Megas XLR? I don't think anybody. I think Cartoon Network has the rights to that, don't they?
Well, yeah, because it was a Cartoon Network show. It wasn't an anime. It was an original show.
That would be Turner, but I don't think Crunchyroll would have it.
That would fall more under Warner Brothers, sort of, since Warner Brothers kind of bought out Turner, and so a lot of the Cartoon Network shows that people remember fondly falls under the Otter Media umbrella to an extent. It gets complicated depending on the specific shows, because some shows that air on Adult Swim, although partially financed by Cartoon Network and Adult Swim, may not necessarily be distributed through the same channels. But that's also why a lot of the DC animated shows were airing on Cartoon Network almost exclusively for a good chunk of time, because Warner Brothers kind of controls, I don't know to what extent, but Cartoon Network kind of falls under Warner Brothers' tenure. So in terms of Megas XLR, you'd have to take it up with Warner Brothers to see if they want to redistribute it. And if there's probably enough of a demand, I can see them thinking, oh, hey, yeah, let's just crank out a DVD release. But if in terms of a full-on Megas XLR revival, I doubt it, mostly just because
I just want Megas on DVD is all I really want. Like, that was a great show.
Like that I can see being more likely. A revival, not so much. I mean, there's a lot of people that are wanting a revival of shows like Symbionic Titan, but we know that is never going to happen.
Are you kidding me? Like, I think a couple of other series are more likely than Symbionic Titan, which is sad, because I know a lot of people love that. RPX also said, expect the return of the fan sub Underground. They left?
Yeah, that's the thing. I mean,
I don't think they left.
They never really left, but they did kind of change a little bit, where most of the piracy websites tend to steal their subtitles from Crunchyroll. But there are some shows that do still get the fan sub treatment. Those are usually shows that not even Crunchyroll licenses, or it's stuff that is really, really niche, or in an area that I'm more familiar with, a lot of the live-action tokusatsu shows that are airing that nobody really in the U.S. outside of Shout Factory or Kraken Entertainment has thought to license, which thankfully they have started to license, particularly shows like Garo. But again, the fan sub community, there's always that demand. It's always going to be there. There is no way for it to go away. It really just depends on what shows these other companies and streaming services choose not to license. And that's pretty much a major factor. And that's why you'll still see fan subs for shows like the earlier seasons of Baki the Grappler, because despite the new Netflix show, nobody has bothered to pick up the older episodes, so that way people can actually understand what the hell is going on in the Netflix show.
Just sad, because I'd like that, because that's like my main apprehension to watching Baki. So Kasaibo is also expressing some interests in the dubbing aspect of it. Specifically, he's bringing up Jamie Markey botching Miss Kobayashi's Dragon Maid's dub. Specifically, also bringing up a quote from Markey. I believe it's a quote anyway. If there are any line changes in any anime, any script, anything that ever offended anyone who unironically used the terms like SJW and feminist agenda, I wrote them all. Jamie Markey. I don't think that would, because here's the thing. If they wanted to do, like, I get the international distribution, but let's just say for the sake of argument, it goes into the dubs. Sony is at least wise enough to be able to see, like, if somebody's pissing off our market, we're going to take them out, and they don't get to do it no more.
Yeah, to a point, though. Again, Sony does have a bit of history of pushing for censorship
They do.
as late, and so what it would take is that it would have to take one of those changes, not necessarily pissing off the market, but pissing off the original creators of the anime.
That's
Because
true.
a lot of people don't realize is that the voice casting, the scripts, a lot of that has to be run by the original production committee.
Well, and correct me if I'm wrong. I haven't watched Miss Kobayashi, but I think either you or Alex has. Didn't it piss off the creator that she did that?
No, not
Okay.
that I heard of.
Not that I
It
heard
pissed
of.
people off.
Yeah.
Most people refer to Romney's brought this up before, but most people refer to a line that Lukua said that was changed in the dub, where Lukua later, Lukua's a very busty dragon woman,
Yeah.
and she most of the time wears a kind of a low cut tank top.
Yeah, and there's an episode where she
later on-
comes in a little bit more tasteful.
Yeah, a little more. She's wearing a sweater, and the English dub line had her say, something like the patriarchy had me cover up or something shit like that. Oh, it was a dumb line. I agree.
Yeah, it's bad taste.
Well, bad taste, but it also went against the original intention of the scene from both the original manga and the original intention of the creator. And so, for anything like that to really be rooted out, it would have to be something big enough to get the people in Japan's attention and get them angry. But for the most part, I mean, shows like Kobayashi's Dragon Maid tailors to a specific niche. It would have to take some really monumental localization F-up for something like Attack on Titan or My Hero Academia, than having that firestorm reach Japan. That is what it would take, but the likelihood of that happening, I don't really see, mostly because, well, the shows that they seem to be doing these sort of arbitrary changes to are, again, these niche shows that tend to skew older, that tend to be tailored towards particular otaku of culture, for lack of a better term.
Gotcha. This one, actually, Alex has been kind of engaging in, and I want to bring it up too. Jiro brings up no more unedited openings or endings music. Think 4K kids raps. What the simulcasts have the openings?
Every one of them do. Every
Oh,
anime
I always thought
pretty
they
much
just cut into
retains-
the episode.
Well,
No,
the key thing is that the stuff that's on the streaming services, they don't cut into. The only times they cut into it is if they're airing it on TV. So if they're airing it on Adult Swim, that is when they cut down the theme songs. That's kind of the only time that happens, but that's more just because, well, people are very stingy for ad time. And so in the case, for example, the JoJo anime, they truncate the opening a little bit, so that way the ending sequence can be aired in its entirety because, well, if you're going to have an anime that has Savage Garden as the ending theme, you may as well see to it that the animated sequence with, Savage Garden gets the airplay, even if it means truncating the original opening. And so it's only when it's airing specifically on television where they cut out the openings and endings, because that's more of an issue with American television and the way it's structured in regards to advertising.
So at that point, like, okay, I get that concept, but I don't see them cutting these things out. I mean, Sony Music is a monster, even I'll admit that, but I don't think they're going to be playing into any of this.
Yeah,
No.
I really don't see them omitting or changing the theme songs again, except in maybe the rare cases where it's like a popular licensed song. The best example I always think of was Eden of the East from like a decade ago.
Yeah.
The Japanese version played Falling Down by Oasis, and when Funimation picked up the series, they really couldn't pay out for the whole song for the whole series. So out for the DVD release, they did cut the opening out. They still had the opening, but they changed the opening to a piece of score that was, or not a score. It was another song written for the anime.
Okay.
And that was for the DVD release from episodes 2 through, I think it was 12 or 13. I can't remember now. But yeah, so those are the times that I see that happening, is if an opening theme song or ending theme song gets omitted, is when it's like a popular Western licensed song that would cost people like Sony or Funimation too much money to pay out for licenses.
Yeah, that's actually a very, very common thing because copyright law works differently in Japan than it does here. Because another good example of an anime that avoided this because someone was able to talk sense into the director was LR, because the director of LR wanted to use Beatles music, which, as anybody who knows anything about music history knows, is a real pain in the ass to
It's a
license.
cluster F to be able to do it.
And it would basically bankrupt any anime distributor who would try to distribute it as is. Fortunately, they were able to talk sense into the director, and so they only had to worry about the one song by Billy Preston that was licensed, which even then, some accounts conflict on it, but some people say, oh, this was created specifically for the show, but others have pointed out, no, this song existed before. It's just, the people representing Billy Preston allowed it to be used for the show. But yeah, I mean, another recent example of this is with the Netflix distribution of Evangelion. One of the key things that people took a lot of issue with is that they had to take out Fly Me to the Moon, which was the recurring ending theme for Evangelion when they licensed it to Netflix. And yeah, that's actually a very, very common thing. That's actually the reason why there are certain video games that they have never re-released or ported. A good example is Crisis Core and Dirge of Cerberus.
I was going to say Dirge is in there.
Yeah, because Dirge of Cerberus licensed songs from Gacht and also licensed Gacht's likeness for the character of G. Mm-hmm. And so it's a case where Dirge of Cerberus ain't going to get any sort of re-release unless they re-license the music and re-license Gacht's likeness. This is also why the only way to play Crisis Core is either through an emulator or through a PSP, because Square ain't licensing the likeness of, superstar pop star Gacht to re-release it, because that ain't cheap.
It is not. And then the last thing I kind of want to address here, because again, we do have other stories to be able to get to, is Jiro also brings up, I'm kind of curious if they will try to grab a lot more titles and also increase the monthly sub. I think that's, given the discussion that Alex is having with him, I think that's likely, that this is probably what they're going to try and do with it, is they're going to try and accommodate to even more niches, a lot more demographics, and be able to get the distribution for them. I mean, am I incorrect in that?
I think it seems likely, and I think a large part of what will affect that is COVID, because when you look at what it takes to do the simul subs and the simul dubs, where they basically get access to the episode scripts and try to whip those things up within days, if not hours, of the show airing in Japan. I think what will affect which shows get the simul sub treatment and the simul dub treatment will largely depend on where the anime industry is post, both during the rest of this pandemic and beyond, and how the changes made because of COVID will affect the way anime is produced and distributed in Japan. And that's going to probably be the real deciding factor.
All right. So let's go ahead and move on into the next story, because we are running out of time at least a little bit, because we actually have to be done by a certain point. Otherwise, people will miss shifts, or at least will be really tired at the end of it. So the next story I want to get into, and this is actually a more recent one that listeners brought to my attention, is that Capcom, unfortunately, has become the victim of a cyber attack. We don't necessarily know who the third party was that committed the cyber attack, but we do know that even though Capcom has made it out to be, it's not a big deal, we're learning more and more it actually probably was a big deal for Capcom. Right now, I believe the count is that approximately 1 to 2 terabytes of data were stolen, and probably will show up somewhere on some black market. Unless I'm wrong, if it's gone bigger than that since then, but I believe it's 1 to 2 terabytes. We also know that, or the company has confirmed that there is no... They don't think right now the customer data has been breached, but I have heard people bouncing back and forth that there might have been some customer data in the 1 to 2 terabytes that they took. And also as a result of the attack, Capcom has said that they have halted operations of their internal networks as of November 2nd. So at that point, they're looking to try and figure out what the hell happened, as well as who attacked them, and figure out safeguards to be able to move on from there. We did also get our usual public relations statement from Capcom in regards to this. They tried to alleviate people's concerns that their data might have been breached, but also basically made it clear that they're still investigating the process, and so we don't even know everything that came into there. So already with this is concerning. We're never happy to hear when companies like this get hit. I will at least say, and this is going to sound kind of callous, I'm at least a little bit more optimistic when it comes to third-party handlers, as opposed to, say, Sony or Microsoft, or even Steam to an extent, because that's a whole other level of effery that can happen with that, because that can F with the service, that can F with the consoles themselves, or even, patches, things like that. it's a much bigger mess when it's the actual console makers as opposed to a third party. I'm not saying that it isn't bad for them. I'm just saying it's at least a little bit more manageable to some extent when it comes to that. But thankfully, Capcom also said that they are coordinating with law enforcement, and the goal here is to find out who did this. So I don't know if this affected any of you guys. I know I actually double-checked. It didn't affect me.
Yeah, and likely the only areas where players would actually be affected would probably be with, well, games like Resident Evil Resistance and Monster Hunter, where you have microtransactions and stuff like that.
Yeah, I actually tried to look and see if the world servers suffered anything from this. I couldn't find anything, but
yeah. And looking at what we're seeing from the article reporting on it, it looks like the servers that were specifically targeted basically primarily contained like emails and files. So whether or not that means that they were targeting a part of Capcom that was actually part of the development, or maybe if it was just, maybe the accounting part of it, or maybe the more bureaucratic logistical side of things, we don't know. And especially given that Capcom, although they have a multimedia presence, they're not as involved to such a degree as, say, Sony. And so it could even just be a simple case where maybe they weren't this third-party group that was attempting this attack may not necessarily have been targeting Capcom specifically. It could have just been that they probably tried initiating this attack on multiple game companies, and then Capcom was the one that they managed to actually get somewhat of a score from. And again, it really depends on what they managed to come away with, because we don't really know. We don't know if it was just a bunch of internal emails regarding planned announcements or stuff like that, or if it was a full-on game that was leaked, like what happened with Ubisoft with Watch Dogs Legion being fully leaked to the public. Again, that will remain to be seen, especially if we take a look at what Capcom has coming down the pipe. I think the most forthcoming release that is even really on anybody's radar is Devil May Cry 5 Special Edition. I could be wrong,
yeah,
though.
That was one of those things that I was kind of worried about. The other one was maybe the source code for Monster Hunter Rise. I saw being brought up in a couple of forums. I don't know.
Yeah, and even then, if it was a case of where stuff like that had been acquired, it would have basically been leaked out by now on the relevant servers, because, again, people work quickly, and so more than likely they were probably trying to get a hand on some more personal internal information, maybe even trying to access certain servers that only the higher-ups at Capcom would have access to. It's probably just a case of they probably targeted multiple game companies, and Capcom was the one that basically bit.
So Jiro the Hero in our chat says it was Konami, lol. Man, that'd be hilarious if it was, wouldn't it?
I mean, corporate espionage can't necessarily be ruled out, because that is a thing that does happen.
Well, but it would be great because Konami would be like, we don't care about games anymore. Go attack Capcom. Go attack Capcom.
Well, I mean, again, it really depends on whether they would be trying to find out anything, trying to leak trying to get a hold of anything being developed by Capcom. Again, corporate espionage is nothing new to the gaming industry. No. It's very much a case of, hey, if you're going to try to figure out what the competition is doing so you can basically beat them to the punch.
I've even heard of companies using it to cover their ass when they ask companies to go and do remasterings of their games or whatever. They just do it so that they can keep track of what's going on. It's still considered espionage, but yeah, it happens.
Yeah, and so that is also another possibility, is that it could have been a rival games company or even a smaller, lesser-known games company like SNK, for example, trying to target them. That is also a very real possibility. It could even be a case where maybe it was some sort of Yakuza sort of related thing, where maybe it was some sort of seedy, like some sort of seedier operation.
They didn't pay their healthcare bills, and Konami hacked them because, Yakuza.
Again, that actually is likely, considering that the CEO of Konami oversees the board of health insurance in Japan.
And I think somebody actually did confirm ties to the Yakuza for that guy, didn't they?
Yeah.
Yeah,
so
there you go.
It's one of those cases where corporate espionage, Yakuza involvement, these are all incredibly likely considering what we're dealing with. And so nothing can really be ruled out, because we don't know to what extent what information was compromised.
Yeah.
All that has really been confirmed thus far is that it appears that it doesn't seem to have affected any financial information of any of the players, which, again, that could very well be the case of, for as far as Capcom even knows, they maybe think, maybe this wasn't affected, but then for all we know, someone who maybe spent more than they probably should have on Resident Evil Resistance will find their information suddenly being sold on the dark web.
Yeah. So Alex, final thoughts on this one. I mean, it sucks. Like, we don't want to hear about cyber attacks happening to third-party companies, much less first-party companies. But it's unfortunately just a sign of the times at this point.
Yep, this is the day we live in, where cyber connect information is the new currency. So always be careful with your information, everybody.
Oh, there you go. Oh no, wait. Here's an even better one. RPX is blaming SNK. They're wanting to know when they can actually do Street Fighter versus SNK again, or Capcom versus SNK again.
Yeah, I mean,
that would be cool.
I used SNK as an example, but if anything, I'd be more likely probably, Namco probably try anything like, hey, we need to finally, do Tekken Cross Street Fighter like we were promised. But again, there are multitudes of different companies, and it's not even limited just to the ones that are direct rivals like SNK or Konami. It could even be, other lesser-known companies or even companies that they wouldn't suspect. I mean, we forget that there was that massive corporate lawsuit raid against Square Enix by SNK because of the manga High School Girl that Square was distributing using, imagery and content copyrighted by SNK that literally led to a full-on SWAT raid on the Square Enix offices. And so it could even be a company that nobody would even suspect. I mean, for all we know, it could even be a company like Ubisoft trying to make some sort of a power play in Japan. We never know, because I know that Capcom has distributed some Ubisoft games in Japan in the past.
All right, so let's go ahead and move on into the next story that we have, which is a little bit of a discussion, but we're going to have to cut it just a little bit, just because of time, but we're still going to get into this. So this is a new segment that I would like to call on the podcast, What Science? Because they don't happen that often, but occasionally we do get stories where we can talk about actual science. And it's actually pretty cool to be able to do that. So this is one that was actually brought up by a listener, and once I got my hands on the story, I had to talk about it. So we're going to be talking about the asteroid Psyche 16. So for those who don't know what it is, or what Psyche 16 is, I think it's Psyche, not Psyche.
It would be Psyche, because usually they name asteroids after Greek gods, and so the Greek goddess is pronounced Psyche.
Okay. So Psyche 16 is an asteroid that right now, I'm not sure on the exact distance and things like that, but it is orbiting between Mars and Jupiter. So that's quite a bit of distance here, and frankly, an asteroid belt kind of going between them. But we're talking about a big mother humper of an asteroid. I was looking in this article to get the exact diameter for it. It's a couple of 100 miles, I believe.
135 miles.
Thank you. 135 miles. And what we've actually been able to discover through observation of the asteroid is that there's actually there's resonance for a lot of metals that we frankly all use in our everyday life. Just to kind of bring this up, we have high deposits of nickel. Let's see, I'm bringing this up again.
Yeah. Nickel, iron, platinum, iridium, and rhenium. And also there's been some talk of maybe even some unidentifiable elements that are existing on Psyche 16. And so this has made the science community, specifically NASA and even private companies that are looking into space travel, a buzz. And the main reason being is that a lot of people are bringing up possible missions of exploration, or possibility of even getting to the asteroid in the first place, because I guess since this whole thing has started, it's gone a little bit more into the Mars side of it. So we're not talking a whole lot. It's changed as far as miles from what I understand. It's more like tens to hundreds of miles versus thousands. And guys, we're talking days worth of distance between here and Mars. But there's also been lots of discussion on possibly mining this place or even exploring it and seeing if maybe we can find some new elements, be able to do some scientific research there. So much so that actually one of the things that has kind of floored me is they basically took an old school plan for Mars back in the 90s. If people remember when they discovered that they were possibly going to have, like they'd possibly discovered water on Mars, like the first time that they made that call, or even like the weird faces on there in topography, is one of the proposed missions was to send a skeleton crew to Mars. Specifically, I think one of the people on that needed to be like a fuel specialist or a chemist. And basically, it's a one-way trip to Mars.
They have to get there, and then basically through means of high school chemistry, be able to find a way to fuel their way back, kind of thing. So they had to get there, do exploration, but also had to find a way to get back. Obviously, they would be giving enough food and everything like that. And so a lot of people have been taking this plan and trying to implement it with Psyche 16. Now, currently, the only plan that has been decided is that a probe is being sent to Psyche 16 to go and look at it and see if maybe through preliminary scans they can find anything new. But this has got the science community abuzz just because of all the people discussing an actual trip to this. And I can already see a ton of you in the chat readying your Armageddon jokes. It's okay. You can do it.
Yeah, and I mean, one thing about this article that has me, kind of tilt my head a little bit is the idea of space mining, especially given that the calculations made is that if you were to mine the metals of Psyche 16, it would total to $18 quintillion. For those of you who kind of want to understand how big that is, that's 18 zeros after the number 10.
Yep.
That's a lot of cheddar cheese.
But they also make a very viable complaint here, is that, okay, if you mine this, because it's in such more immediate supply, you would kind of drown out your own market. Because now nickel, iridium, rhenium, they would be more available. And so at that point would therefore, due to market, be cheaper. And there's a lot of questions about this as to whether or not it's even possible. Do we even have the hardware? Do we have a viable enough shuttle to make the trip? And that's what I find the most interesting about this is, like, we haven't had discussions like this, I want to say, since like the early 90s about going into space exploration.
Yeah. The other thing I would be concerned with as well is in terms of who is mining it. Yeah, either the market would be, would basically suffer and everything would get cheaper, or we'd run into the issue that we currently see on Earth with diamonds, where you would have one company controlling the supply and basically artificially marking up the cost when they don't really need to, because let's face it,
let's be honest about that. There's how many organizations are actually looking into space travel? We have NASA, obviously, a government organization, but then, like, when it comes to the private sector, which we know that some have looked into it, but the some that have looked into it are the sum up of 3-4 companies, 2 of which basically said they can't do it.
Yeah, I mean, the major ones you'd have to watch out for, I mean, of course, there's the obvious one. You'd have SpaceX, run by Elon Musk, and maybe in a close second of a company trying to compete with it would be Virgin Galactic, the company run by Richard Branson, which has been kind of the only direct competitor regarding creating commercial space flight. Yeah. And I know they've made because I remember I was in junior high when they were trying to test their Spaceship One models and basically trying to perfect that. And so that, again, raises the question of if they start trying to put in the measurements in place to try to make space mining a thing, as well as finding a way to transport it back to Earth, which, granted, there would be a whole bajillion other issues that would come with it between trying to get the mining equipment to work in a zero-gravity environment where things like inertia and friction aren't as strong of factors as they are here on Earth, as well as making sure that you're bringing back enough ore that is actually usable, as well as having it come back in one piece, having it not completely break apart upon re-entry into our atmosphere. Yeah. That's even assuming if it makes the journey back to Earth orbit, because there's a bajillion million things that could go wrong. And that's even when you're getting into, when you're running into the idea of cascading, space debris, which is a very real issue that people at NASA and the ISS have been trying to deal with. Sure. Of the idea of, if one badly placed piece of debris hits this satellite, it'll then hit this satellite and this satellite and this satellite, and before you know it, you basically have a wall of shrapnel circling the Earth. Yeah, pretty much. But here's the reason. I think a lot of people are going to look at me and see all the smiling as insensitive. The reason I'm interested in this is because I like the fact that we're having the discussion. Because here's the thing: is a lot of people are bringing up in our live chat, there are near-Earth asteroids that we could look into that actually might have these things. But we haven't been talking about it. A lot of space exploration has halted because it's, financially not viable.
to especially to like the United States government. That's why I like the fact that the companies like Virgin Galactic, and correct me if I'm wrong, is Tesla still in there too? I think.
Tesla is separate from SpaceX. I mean, Elon Musk runs both, but they are two separate companies.
That's probably what I'm thinking of, because I knew Musk was trying to do something with space.
SpaceX is Elon Musk's company.
Yeah.
Tesla has nothing to do with it. There's been some engineers that have gone from one to the other, but in the eyes of like corporate law here in the States, they are two completely separate companies with their own boards of directors, so on and so forth. And so, yeah, Elon Musk is the CEO of SpaceX, who also happens to be the CEO of Tesla.
Yeah, and so at that point, like, I like the fact that these private organizations, because look, Virgin could probably do it better than the United States government could at this point. There's not really a whole lot of enthusiasm to put money towards NASA, unless it's towards things like, you know, space exploration and being able to study. But then you could also have somebody like SpaceX or even Virgin going in there and maybe testing the waters on it. But you also run into the same problem that Romney has mentioned. They know that they can do it, and ergo, they are going to mark up the price because they can.
Yeah.
And I'm not necessarily saying they're bad for doing that. It makes sense. That space is uncharted territory. They're basically the East India Trading Company at this point.
Well, it's more kind of a race of trying to see who will be the first East India Trading Company is more the issue here. And another factor that the reason why space exploration hasn't been as prioritized is also because we're no longer engaged in, well, a Cold War with other sovereign nations. The whole reason we had the space race was because, oh, crap, the Russians put a satellite in space. We need to outdo the Russians. And what do? We went to the moon. And so that's another factor that there isn't that layer of motivation. So unless, say, a Chinese space agency or a Russian space agency decides to make an active push to send probes and actually mine these asteroids, that would be the kind of thing that would light a fire under NASA's butt, and specifically the U.S. government's butt. Mm-hmm. But because that's not really a factor, that's a contributing factor as to why space exploration has been on the back burner. And honestly, as enticing as it would be to try to mine these asteroids and bring it to Earth, honestly, I think the better approach, one that would be more feasible, would be mining the asteroid and then using those minerals to then colonize Mars. Basically, setting up things on Mars and then using the asteroids like that to try to bolster.
And that's a plan that's also been presented. Is basically using the stuff from Psyche 16 to build colonization on Mars, which I like the idea of it because it makes sense.
Yeah, I mean, and it also would be less risky because then you're not having to worry about trying to bring ore from an asteroid all the way back to Earth. If it's already in Mars's orbit and Mars doesn't have as strong of an atmosphere, so you don't run the risk of losing everything on re-entry. Mm-hmm. The only downside is that this would have to be at a point where we already have things like smelting and other shaping mechanisms on that Mars colony, because it takes a lot to shape metal into something usable. Yeah. And although 3D printing is a thing, when you're trying to 3D print metals, that's going to take a lot. I mean, we're still, like, 3D printing as we have it, we primarily have it able to do it with plastics and, in some circumstances, organic materials like tissue. This is what people have been pushing for, things like lab-grown meat. Some people have been pushing for 3D printing for organs. And so, although that would be more feasible, that would have to be at like a later stage where we've already set up a colony on Mars and it already has some sort of a smelting and forging operation on that colony that is already in place and can produce the amount of energy needed to melt these metals down to a state where they can be shaped into whatever is needed to be made. Mm-hmm.
And so at that point, there are so many things to figure out here. This is why in a lot of cases when I wanted to bring this up, I just wanted to bring this aspect up. It's being talked about because this is something that does need to be talked about. You know, you brought up an interesting idea, and I actually saw an interesting question when it came to regards to this. Some of the minerals that we're talking about, you know, they've got viability here, but what would they do on a hostile terrain like Mars? There's actually discussion as to whether or not, you know, being able to use metals like that, would it even work to be able to build an outpost on Mars? Let's ask those questions. Let's actually try to figure this out. It's amazing. Because at that point, it would be cool to be able to see.
Especially when you consider.
Go ahead.
Well, especially when you consider, that is a good point, especially when you consider things like oxidation and stuff like that. Would these metals deteriorate more quickly on the surface of Mars, or maybe would they last a bit longer because of the lack of an atmosphere? These are also very viable things that people need to when it comes to space exploration and eventually colonization, which I'm more optimistic in thinking that we will eventually get to that point. It's just a case that there's still a figured out before colonization can become viable, and that's even assuming that we're alone in the universe.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, man, I'd like to think not, but because and that's mainly the reason. Like, I know that a lot of people are probably looking at this and going, well, maybe you should hate this or whatever. I like the fact that it's being discussed, because then at that point we can actually solve these questions. Like the biggest question, which I saw a lot of scientists bringing up, is it even possible to mine an asteroid? That's a good question as to whether or not, like, look, we've all seen Armageddon and they had to use the specific drill bit and all that, but we actually do have to ask this stuff. Is like, can we even, like, in order to be able to do spacefaring, you have to be able to manage, or at least be able to excavate the necessary means to be able to make these outposts from existing areas. It's not like you can just ship titanium from Earth all the time. You have to find it somewhere else. And so at that point, like, let's discuss these questions. Let's actually figure them out. Because then at that point, we can actually look to expand.
Yeah, I mean, at least it makes more sense than people wanting to drink the moon water.
Like, yes. It's actually kind of funny that somebody brought that up. Jiro did, about drinking water from ice found on the moon. Yeah, ice was found. So was rust.
And who knows what else, because even if you were to bring that ice and water back to Earth, there's a lot of stuff on Earth that could compromise the sample. Plus, you know, this little thing called solar radiation that could also be present in the water, meaning that you could be inadvertently giving yourself several new flavors of cancer by drinking it.
The other thing I also want to bring up before I get to Alex here is when this was brought up, particularly the listener that brought the story to me, he was a little annoyed. Because, we're always looking into exploring space. Can we finally look towards seeing what's actually at the bottom of the ocean? And here's the thing. To me personally, this all goes hand in hand. Because if we can figure out how to do it in the vacuum environment, we could eventually figure out how to do it in a higher pressure environment, like, say, like the darkest depths of the Marianas Trench. Kind of thing. And so at that point, like, I kind of see both of them kind of going hand in hand. You can't necessarily explore one way without being able to explore the other. And that's another thing that's cool.
Especially when you consider that if we are able to go to other planets, there may be some planets that are going to have a similar highly pressurized environment.
Yes.
And I mean, there are a lot of factors to consider, since, again, with space, you're dealing with both the presence/absence of gravity, which will affect things like inertia, thrust, and a lot of these other forces of motion that we take for granted. But then likewise, under a high pressure environment like, you know, the bottom of the ocean, those same forces are going to affect you in a completely different way. Yeah. Where, okay, like, you may be able to use this drill in the deepest part of the Marianas Trench, but if you're trying to do it on an asteroid in a zero gravity environment, it may end up turning too fast and end up spiraling out of control or shattering itself. Yep. And even if you're able to mine anything with it from the asteroid, there's no guarantee that you'll get enough usable ore out of it that isn't sent off into the vacuums of space. And that's not even factoring the case of, you're sending these tiny little fragments of metal at a very high speed in a zero gravity environment. What's to stop it from, tearing the spacesuit apart or tearing the hull of the spacecraft apart or doing all sorts of other damage.
Which is definitely things that have to be considered with it. A lot of things would have to change in order to be able to make this work. Like, we couldn't run off of the same spacesuits that we've had since, 70s, 80s. We'd have to definitely adapt to this stuff. Alex, I'm going to let you kind of have a word in on this. Like, what's your take on the stuff we're discussing?
Very fascinating. I don't know much really to comment about it, but I do think it's very interesting, and I certainly would like to see where it goes from here.
Yeah, I like the idea of at least considering the possibility of exploration. I'm not saying, like, go foolhardy and take a very small shuttle and just see if you can make it work, but at least try to do the scenarios. Try to figure out, okay, if we use this drill bit, is it actually going to even pierce the asteroid? If not, do we need to go towards something that maybe we don't even have on this planet to be able to pierce it? Like, is diamond not even going to do it, or whatever would be the highest one? Are we going to have to go with some mineral that we don't even know exists yet?
Yeah, or alternately, are we going to have to then trade up something like a drill bit for maybe using something like a laser, using light energy to mine it, which is a possibility, but again, raises the same question of, okay, will this be viable enough? Will this give us the ore that we can actually use, or is
the ore going to be viable enough? Is it even going to be worthwhile to mine this stuff? Because here's the thing, we're saying like $10 quintillion here, but we're making a lot of big assumptions. What if the minerals that are on there are highly inferior because it's an asteroid, like, zero G environment? It could easily be like inferior stuff.
Yep, and another thing is that it could also be highly irradiated to the point where it's dangerous to even interact with it. Because again, solar radiation is very much a thing that astronauts have to deal with. That's why there have been so many people so many companies, and even NASA trying to do a study to simulate spaceflight with that factor removed, because Earth has this little thing called the ozone layer that keeps our planet safe from solar radiation, when we're not punching holes into the layer itself. But that is another factor of, if we bring these minerals back to Earth, is it going to give everybody who comes into contact with it radiation poisoning?
Yeah, exactly. And these are things that have to be considered for space travel to even be a viable thing. Otherwise, it's too dangerous to be able to do. So
yeah, we don't need any more random rock spiders on the planet.
Yeah. Much less bringing on random xenomorphs. I love that also somebody brought up the concept of, you want a corporation to do this stuff for us? Didn't we learn from Alien?
I mean, it's not limited to just Alien. So. I mean, Alien, Weyland-Yutani. I mean...
I'd like to think we did, but...
Like Weyland-Yutani, the Tyrell Corporation, whatever the name of the company is in Avatar, I don't really know, but...
Yeah, James Cameron likes to make up interesting company names and then blame things on them.
Well, yeah, but that's another factor as well, because then you run the risk of a company putting profit before and not...
Sure.
I mean, you basically could end up with something like Space Jaws, where you have people caring more about profits and dismissing the actual risks, and then for all we know, the minerals they bring back to Earth, or whatever is inside the asteroid, we don't know, could end up causing more problems. So, again, my money would be on something like Space Jaws.
Man, now I'm just thinking of sharks in space. This was not a good thing to discuss. Now I'm thinking of sharks in space.
I mean, you gotta say it like this. Sharks in space!
Exactly. You have to do it that way. All right, so let's go ahead and get into the last story that we have, which is more of so this is one of the big discussions that we've been talking about with you guys since a couple of weeks ago. You guys, throughout 2020, have brought up, okay, COVID has changed a lot of the landscape, especially when it comes to media and how to do it, how to develop it. And it's not just necessarily changed filming or TV. It's also changed games and how they're made and the precautions that have to be taken into account to be able to do that. And so one of the things that I wanted to tackle first, because I think the answers are going to be pretty much straightforward for it, as opposed to some of the complications we're going to be dealing with later, is we are on the eve of a new generation of games, or at least of gaming hardware. We have the PS5 and the Xbox Series X coming very, very soon. And there's already been discussion and confirmation, might I add, that we are looking at a price increase for games. Now, for the longest time, video games have been $59.99. They've gone up in some cases when it comes to various bigger games where they might highlight into the $69.99 territory. But it's never really gone further above that unless we're talking about deluxe editions, collector's editions, things like that have been a more recent aspect of the gaming industry. So now we're actually talking about doing I believe the AAA companies are basically saying across the board, it would be a general $20 increase in gaming retail prices. And I've seen tons of debates when it comes to this, that it's necessary, that in order to be able to construct these games, that it's become a necessity to be able to allow these game companies to survive, especially in, whatever rocky landscape that we have. I've also seen arguments basically saying that it's not worthwhile, that game companies need to learn how to spend their money better, which I think all of those are viable arguments. Yes, do prices increase? Naturally they do. But also, we've said it numerous times on this podcast that the exorbitant budgets of games has become a bit of a problem. And so at that point, let's actually get into this. So basically now what we're looking at is a base game would be $80. $80 to $85. I've even heard some cases where a base price might go up as high as $90 US. I'm not even going to try and equate that to other currencies because it either goes up or down, and it gets even more complicated than that. But now we're looking at collector's editions that would be, at bare minimum, $150. Maybe in some cases, depending on the company you're dealing with, $200. So you've already spent a pretty big fraction of what you spent on the console for this collector's edition of a game that better be worthwhile and better not be like, I don't know, another Fallout 76 kind of thing. And so at that point, let's actually get into this. Do we actually, I guess the first question that I want to get into here is, do we actually feel like game prices should increase because of the justification of this is a new console generation with much more hardware demands being put on the gaming companies to be able to develop quality games for them? I'm going to be honest, I get the concept, but I don't know if I'm there. That prices should go up based solely on those. But I'll open it up to you guys next.
I'm kind of in the same camp where I can see the argument, but I'm not quite there in terms of, I mean, when I look at some of the games that I own, some of the games that I've paid for, like 60, that's something like, okay, well, if it's something that I may not end up liking, then, well, 60, whereas paying $80, that's something that is going to really give me pause, thinking, okay, is this game that I'm considering getting really going to be worth it? Especially considering that not every publisher is going to be needing to sell things at that price. And since I'm someone who doesn't really play any of the major AAA games anyway, so I'm the kind of person who waits for price drops, who waits for clearance sales. And so it's one of those cases of, I can see developers and publishers trying to make the argument, but I don't really see a lot of people buying that argument and buying that game unless there's some sort of assurance of quality. I mean, it would have to be a really damn good game to warrant such a high price point.
Or even a company that would have the pedigree of games like, and we're talking pedigree from like the 90s, of the early 2000s, where like Blizzard kind of pedigree, or even in the 90s, Virgin Interactive level of pedigree, to even remotely consider it.
Yeah, and especially considering that really a large chunk of this could be mitigated by not, investing hundreds upon hundreds of millions of dollars into these games and actually scaling back what you're trying to accomplish, because we're reaching this point where a lot of these companies are trying to rely on spectacle. They're trying to rely on like brand, like actors and well-known people, well-known brands, well-known IPs, when that isn't really going to be a guarantee. I mean, and this is as someone who's been kind of going through some of the indie games I've impulse bought, there have been some indie games that I've had a lot more mileage out of compared to the huge AAA releases, because there's just that next level of polish. They didn't try to be more than what they were trying to be. I mean, a good point of comparison would be something like, say, off the top of my head, would probably be something, I'm trying to think of one that more than just me has played. But
I think a perfect example of something that would be higher budget would probably be Death Stranding, considering the level of star power that went into that. And
it would be a good example would be comparing something like Death Stranding, which you play it once and you kind of had this experience, but there's not really much of an incentive to keep going unless you're a completionist. But then you've got something like, say, Bloodstained, which has more replay value.
Yeah.
Again, to a point where you've got like the boss challenge modes, you've got the randomizer roguelike modes, you've got the Zangetsu modes and stuff like that. A game that, although it had a sizable budget, it wasn't, to the exorbitant degree that something like Death Stranding was. And I mean, another good example would even be games like Stardew Valley, as opposed to, Anthem. Both games that involve a fair bit of resource management, but it's a case where one has just more polish and a more satisfying gameplay loop, whereas Anthem, or a better example, Destiny, is trying to wow you with the spectacle of it being a big, sprawling adventure. But again, it kind of goes to that same case of maybe instead of companies trying to wow us with spectacle and trying to use spectacle to generate interest, maybe they should, scale things back and kind of go back to basics and think, hey, let's actually, make a game that has a satisfying gameplay loop. Let's actually, get rid of some of these glitches that we tend to leave in our games to rush these out the door. Let's actually, we don't necessarily need to hire, Norman Reedus and Mads Mikkelsen to play these characters. We can just, bring in established voice actors like David Hayter or Nolan North to do these same roles for, less than what it would cost to hire Norman freaking Reedus.
Yeah, exactly. And there's a lot of things that could be done here that are raising up the amount that you have to give these actors. Like, I can't think that Norman Reedus, like, voiceover, okay, maybe he's fairly cheap, but you had him coming in and doing mocap too, which I'm guessing, like, there is a little bit of an added fee to put him in the suit every day and have
putting
him
in
do
the
it.
suit, as well. In addition to putting him in the suit, also the case of licensing his likeness as well, because that's another. Because I know that was something that came up for things like Wing Commander, where you had
which,
Thomas
from what I
Wilson.
understand, like with Norman, like him and Hideo reached an agreement for that. Like I heard that, and I haven't been able to confirm that, but Hideo pretty much found ways to be able to work things out with a majority of the actors in Death Stranding. But you're bringing up Wing Commander. Those were the days where you couldn't work out deals like that everybody was working off of standard fees. And you're talking about a stellar cast like Mark Hamill, John Rhys Davies, Tom Wilson, Malcolm McDowell, high-paid actors at the time.
Mm-hmm. And it's the kind of thing where game companies need to really... It's very much a case of we're running into the same problem that we're seeing in the film industry, where people keep thinking bigger, better, more flashy stuff, more shiny stuff is going to get people invested. But I'm reminded of the famous George Lucas quote, where a special effect is a means to tell a story. A special effect without a story is a very boring thing. And that's what we're running into with game design, is that, these very flashy cutscenes, these voice lines and mocap with these established actors that we know from television, it's all well and good, but it doesn't really amount to anything if, the game plays like crap.
Well, and what's even better about that, and I'm glad you brought that up, because I think this also needs to be held into account. We've made this comparison numerous times of who's a good director and who's a bad director when it comes to Hollywood. And the consensus that you and I have come to a lot of the time, Romney, is the one who spends their budgets better and cheaply is the one that is considered the better director. And I would say the same thing counts of video game directors as well, being able to find ways to not have to purchase the likeness of the actor, but instead be able to find a mocap model who can be paid for cheaper, who can model that character and be able to do the movements with it. But at the same time, all you have to worry about with the quote AAA actor is paying the voiceover, which is significantly cheaper than having them in the film.
Yeah, I mean, a good example of something like that would be, what Capcom did with both Resident Evil 2 and 3 Remake and Devil May Cry 5, where you still had the same voices and mocap actors. You still had Ruben Langdon, Daniel Southworth, Johnny Young Bosch voicing and doing the mocap for these characters, and then you just brought in these models and said, hey, we'll pay you to stand here, let us scan your face and your body so we can put them in the game, even if they're not really known models. And then they kind of did a composite, like, okay, we have these known models, and then we're going to tweak it here and tweak it here and tweak it here to make them look like the character we're trying to create.
And you probably know this better than me, but because I've only heard this as a concept of rumor with DMC5, is that in one of the ways that they reduced cost in being able to bring people like Johnny in is they didn't necessarily bring him in to do 100% mocap on everything. Like, you're saying the general concept model and everything like that, and then they brought somebody else to emulate. But they did bring him in for key scenes because he wanted to be able to know how Nero would act, when he's, for example, bitch slapping Dante. Because I know that's one of them. I know that's one of them that Johnny did. He was very happy about it and bragged about it. But you had to have them in for those key scenes, which means you're not paying them for the whole duration. You're paying them in segments, which is still acceptable for them. But at the same time, you're also saving a lot on budget.
Yeah, and I mean, another factor as well is that, especially given that there are just some movements that are physically impossible to be done by, even the most experienced of stunt people, you're going to have to animate those manually by hand. But another key factor is that the reason they were able to get Ruben, Daniel, and Johnny back was because they specifically contracted Ruben Langdon's production company, which does a lot of the mocap, because that's how
Yeah.
they got the job on Devil May Cry 3, was that it was specifically his motion capture company that they commissioned and hired, and then brought them in for 4 and then later 5, because they figured, hey, we already have this infrastructure in place, we already have a working
Which was a
relationship
good
with these
decision
people.
because I don't think anybody can envision those 3 not being in Devil May Cry at this point. So it worked out that way too. Ruben is synonymous with Dante.
Yeah, I mean, to be fair, we already know what it looks like when we don't have those 3 in Devil May Cry. Granted, Ninja Theory was dealt a really bad hand because most of the controversial decisions was because Capcom was listening to Inafune thinking, we need to westernize it and not tailor it to the very fan base that made these games popular, and that'll definitely make Call of Duty numbers. Of course, there's a reason why Inafune crashed and burned the way he did, but it goes back to the main point, is that paying $80 for a game, it's kind of one of those cases of, that is a much larger investment. As a consumer, I'm going to very much be one of those, hey, I'm going to really, really be more choosy with what I purchase. Especially considering a lot of it may be available on PS5, because I'm still not even completely sold on whether or not I'm going to buy PS5 or the next Xbox yet, because there hasn't really been enough to entice me, because all we have coming out are games that are also going to be available on current gen. So there's no reason to be an early adopter at this point. And so I look at this and I'm just like, okay, $80, that's something that's going to make me, be a bit more reticent, thinking, okay, maybe instead of buying this day one, maybe I'll wait for a price drop. Maybe I'll wait for it to go on sale. Maybe I'll try a demo if I'm really, really that curious. But it's one of those cases where...
That's unprofessional of you. You should want a PS5 from the get-go.
Yeah, well, anybody who has a problem with that, well, if you're willing to pay for it, I'll get it. But unless you're actually willing to fund the Patreon, you can shut it.
Yeah, there you go. Exactly. Alex, I want you to chime in here because I want to get into the next little bit here because it's going to chain together. But given what is being justified here, is the $20 worth it? The extra $20 for a game?
I guess this is a case where you're going to have to sort of separate your own self from the overall thought of why prices might need to rise. And I think the fact is it might be time for the industry to raise prices, as the technology's improved leaps and bounds in the last decade alone since the launch of the PS3 and the PS4. And, as gamers keep demanding, everything to look like the best, the brightest, and the most polished. So that's the thing. Unless the attitudes of consumers change, right, then you're going to have to just pay out. It's just kind of a fact, but I don't see the attitudes changing. People have complained that the Nintendo Mario re-release wasn't a shiny new HD version. It was mostly just a slightly polished up, spiffy re-release of the old games. People complained. People have been, talking nonstop about how the PS5 is going to have ray tracing and SSD, and it's like, well, this technology costs money, and all these new shiny features, you're demanding 4K, 8K, that costs money, that costs resources and time to invest, right? I get the arguments to the contrary. I get companies are scummy, and I know it's certainly not going to get rid of things like scummy microtransactions and loot boxes.
No. Because
whatever they want to do to get the most dollars and cents out of you, they're going to do. But absolutely. I think for all the other companies in between that want to deliver you a quality product and deliver it in next gen style, assuming they're not going for a retro indie style, like an old platform or whatever. Yeah, unfortunately, it's going to take another $20, $30, $10 to $30 price increase to start offsetting costs.
Okay.
Games are getting expensive. The dollar has depreciated over the time, and again, the overall resources and management. Back in the 80s, you could make a game with probably 4 or 5 people. These days, it's taking hundreds.
Well, you could still make a game with 4 or 5 people. It's just considered indie.
Yes, but I'm talking in terms of your big AAA titles.
No. AAA, we're talking tens of hundreds of people on that team.
Right. But,
so
back in the 80s, back in '85, Super Mario Brothers would be considered AAA by by
Yep.
that decade standards. And yeah, you could do that
That
with
was like 5-man team.
5 to 10 people these days. Something like that, not necessarily Mario, but a big AAA game, a big A-list console title, that's going to be like a 24 people, maybe more. And yeah, there's definitely aspects of the industry that could change. Do they need Mads Mikkelsen and Norman Reedus? No, but
No.
can you deny that Death Stranding was a success? Yeah, you can't. So I don't see the writing's kind of on the wall.
Yes, you can, or yes, you can't deny.
I
want to make sure, because I kind of heard you weird there.
You can't deny. I should say you cannot deny that Death Stranding was a huge success.
All right.
And yeah, maybe that's more the exception than the rule. But if the consumer and the gamers want to continue getting games of that kind of caliber and that kind of quality, that's going to take more money. And I think it's time that maybe we have to all start paying out a little bit more.
So at that point, I want to get into the next bit. I know that we talked about this before, but there are some people who are now joining us for the first time who have not heard us discuss this. And I think it needs to be considered when it comes to AAA. Is bigger always better? We've talked numerous times about the exorbitant budgets that are around a lot of these games. And because of the exorbitant budgets, they have to be these huge MMO-like colossal monsters of games in order to be able to do anything. And I know that some people will bring up the example of Breath of the Wild. And while Breath of the Wild is a big map, I would contest that a better example would probably be something like Red Dead Redemption 2, where you have a colossal map where you might not be able to get as much done in it or it might not even be a third as much populated as Breath of the Wild, but a lot of that is because of Breath of the Wild's map being the size that it is, and they incorporated that into it. But we have a lot of these exorbitant budgets that are going into features that may or may not actually have to be in this game, but they have to be because this other game's doing it. And it doesn't make sense in our game, but damn it, it's got to be in there because the corporate people want it. And so at that point, I want to bring this up again, because people haven't seen our actual discussion on that, but also because we're looking at a new generation where this could be one of the things that needs to be fixed. Could we cut down these budgets and be able to tell, instead of big old 75-hour games, maybe smaller 25-hour games, and be able to actually see better profit margins from them than we would the big 75-hour games? The examples that I will always bring up is basically anything Amy Hennig has worked on in her entire career. I didn't even know this. Now I do, that Amy Hennig is pretty much responsible for a lot of games that I love. She was either part of the story team or she was part of the character team or something like that. I was just barely told that, yeah, she was part of one of my favorite game series ever, The Legacy of Kain. An example of a 20-hour game that is timeless. And it doesn't have to have the big exorbitant budgets or the huge talent trees or anything like that. It still outshines because of story, because of the voice work, and because of the world that you were trying to build. And so at that point, do we need to actually bring this up again? Do we actually have to look at the concept of reducing some of these exorbitant budgets to maybe reduce the price of the game so that it can then profit more?
Yeah, well, it is definitely something worth considering, and I would argue that it is possible, mostly due in large part to the fact that we have a lot of games that pick and choose a lot of disparate elements from a lot of these other AAA titles, but they never find a way to actually make them cohesive. And especially it comes down to whether what the ultimate goal of the game is. The goal of the game to allow the player to explore? Is the goal of the game to tell a story? Is the goal of the game to basically have you play it on a regular daily basis? And those are factors that really need to be considered as part of the design. A good example of a game that I finished recently that had really bad pacing problems because you can tell that they hadn't hammered that out in the design was Castlevania Lords of Shadow, where the way the levels and everything was paced was really, really slow and bogged down and frankly arbitrary. And then you run into that same issue. I mean, a good example is something adding an open world. I guess a good example would be Final Fight Streetwise, trying to basically be like Grand Theft Auto when it was never meant to be. I think a large problem, it kind of goes back to that same pre-production problem where people need to actually, rather than trying to throw in everything and please everyone, people need to understand that, hey, if you have a very focused, fun experience, people will flock to it. A good example of a game that has proven this is Streets of Rage 4, where it didn't try to add a whole bunch of arbitrary features. It just took what made the previous games work, brought them up to a standard for modern game design, and made a fun experience that is fun to replay and revisit time and time again. And it didn't need to add a whole bunch of extra bells and whistles. And I think that's a really part of the issue here, is that we're running into a point where game companies are trying to find a way to please everybody, trying to market established titles to fans who weren't really interested. Again, it's the same problem that Devil May Cry had with Devil May Cry 4, where Capcom was expecting it to make Call of Duty numbers, even though they failed to consider the fact that Devil May Cry, in and of itself, was a very niche type of game with a very niche type of audience. It's the same case where a fighting game is not going to attract the same type of player that you're going to get from a first-person shooter or from an RPG.
Which this is something that has to be taken into consideration. You know, the fact that I'm saying that we have to reduce this, a lot of game executives are going to look at that and go, well, why are we even putting money towards this if it's just towards one demographic as opposed to all of them? Because unfortunately, some executives just kind of work that way. Why don't we appeal to everybody instead of just one niche demographic? Here's the problem, though, is that gamers are these niche demographics. They really are. There's no one size fits all. Some people like shmups. Some people like RPGs. Some people like Call of Duty. Some people like Overwatch. And there's reasons that all of those work. And so at that point, like, I see it as an overall victory if you just cater to the niche. And maybe, just maybe, because a lot of games have been able to do this as well, get somebody to look at it. Get somebody to look at it and invest. And all they have to do is that, and then a friend who is a fan will bring them in. And then at that point, you have a new customer.
Especially considering that one of the big reasons that leads to a game's success, it's not marketing, it's not having a bunch of arbitrary features, it's word of mouth. I mean, when you consider the success of games like Pac-Man and the fact that it basically spread all over the place because people played it in the arcades, told other people about the game, and naturally it spread from there. Same case with games like Streets of Rage or even Street Fighter being like, hey, there's this really fun game that is in this particular genre, and that's what leads. I mean, considering the success of games like Five Nights at Freddy's, Minecraft, Among Us, a lot of these games that just focused on the one thing it wanted to do, did it really well. And then, granted, YouTube has played a large part in a lot of these games becoming popular, but it shows that, hey, if you're catering to a specific niche, it's better to basically do one thing really, really well than to do a million things poorly. And that's something that the AAA publishers really need to understand. Capcom has even learned this lesson. That's why they've had a bit of a resurgence with the Resident Evil remakes and with Devil May Cry, because they realized, okay, rather than trying to please everyone, let's just take what made these work and just do this really, really well. And it paid off with 7. It paid off with the 2 and 3 remakes, although 3 is still up for debate. And that's probably what they're banking on with Resident Evil 8, because they realize, hey, instead of trying to, make Resident Evil into Call of Duty, just letting Resident Evil be Resident Evil worked pretty well.
Yeah, exactly. And you kind of pointed out the big aspect that I want people to take away from is that they didn't try to please everybody. Because I don't know. This is a part of real life. If you try to please everybody, you'll end up upsetting somebody. And so at that point, I wish the gaming industry would take this back into account. I'm not saying that you can't still make games like that. Go and make your Fortnites. But at the same time, maybe you don't need to be making 5 different versions of Fortnite as far as budget. Maybe you can have one big Fortnite, and then you can have a couple of other smaller projects that are being worked on, that are creatively made. As RPX just put in our chat, where games are once again made for gamers by gamers. And specifically on the stories that they want to tell. And that's a big problem, is when you have those big exorbitant budgets and it fails, all the executive sees is the failure. They don't see that, you still got this audience. Which is a big problem with MMOs these days, is, everybody expects those World of Warcraft numbers or for it to be a competitor, and then they look at what I would call the success that Star Wars: The Old Republic, Final Fantasy XIV, Final Fantasy Star Online 2 have been able to share as a success, they don't look at it that way because it's not 13 million people playing it, kind of thing.
Yeah, it's very much the same case. I mean, another close example would be the fighting game scene, where it's a case where people are immediately expecting fighting games to hit those major Evo numbers, but as ArcSys has proven, like, you don't necessarily have to be, Capcom or Namco to build an audience. I mean, for the longest time, Guilty Gear was very much an underground fighting franchise where only certain people really knew about it, but because of that small but passionate fan base, it gave ArcSys what it needed to eventually license themselves out to other companies, and that's what eventually led to stuff like Dragon Ball FighterZ, where they basically looked and said, hey, we have experience making these really popular fighting games that have a really strong fan base and have tournaments all across the globe.
That's one thing that I think a lot of big game executives don't understand anymore, is that, a lot of these game companies were small businesses, and they had their niche audiences where they'd earned the loyalty. And so then at that point, now they're just like, oh, well, it's Guilty Gear, it's totally going to resonate with everybody. No, it's not. That's not.
No.
There's a reason that there was a small audience that grew over time supporting ArcSys. And now why they can do projects like Dragon Ball FighterZ is because they have the loyalty. They have the faith behind the brand. And unfortunately, when you talk about companies like Bethesda, they may have had the faith back in the day. I would argue they didn't. But now they certainly don't.
Nope. I mean, they had it up until Skyrim, but it's very much in the post-Skyrim era where a lot of that goodwill has since gone underground, especially when you look at how they've handled the properties that they have acquired, like Fallout and Doom and a lot of these other companies. It's just a case of where you have that issue where they aren't understanding what made these IPs as influential as they were. I mean, and that's pretty much the key thing here, is that these companies need to actually understand that, hey, rather than trying to take all of the pie, maybe be happy with the 1 or 2 slices you get, because if you try to take all of the pie, nobody gets the pie. But if you're satisfied with the slices you get, everybody gets the pie, and naturally that means that whoever's making the pie is going to make more pies, because then it means, oh, more people are satisfied with the pies.
Okay.
And so it's just a case. It's the same case you see with films that try to basically appeal to everyone or try to be the next big thing. The best example I can think of a film that crashed and burned because it tried to do what Marvel did was the reboot of The Mummy, where it was basically trying to be...
Yes.
Yeah, it was basically trying to be the new MCU, and it was trying to rush straight to the Avengers, not realizing that Marvel, and by extension Disney, took more than 5 or so years to lay the groundwork before we got Avengers. People forget how long it actually took and the level of buildup they had to see.
Hence why Justice League and this Monster Universe failed. They didn't take the time and investment.
Nope, they basically wanted to rush straight to the big team-up, and even DC crashed and burned because they thought, oh, well, maybe if we do the team-up first and then do the solo movies. But, again, it's that classic case of people just need to understand that same classic thing. If you try to appeal to everybody, you'll appeal to nobody. Like, we see it with films, we see it in video games. This is why... more recently, I've been having more fun with a lot more of the indie developed titles, because they at least know what they want to be, they know what they're trying to do, and they do it fairly well, to some degrees. There have been some indie titles I've played where they've tried, they made a valiant effort, but maybe something along the way they stumbled a little bit, but that happens. And so in terms of trying to reduce these budgets, the companies just need to understand that, gaming is a multimedia sort of thing, but rather than trying to force everything to be this vast multimedia franchise, focus on the core game loop. Focus on the key thing that you want the player to do. Sadly, this is kind of something that a lot of the gacha games understand is, okay, well, we want to condition our players to play this game every single day and to keep coming back to it. And
that looks really enticing to a lot of gaming executives. Coming back every day to do your dailies or whatever.
Yeah,
and it's one of those things that I'm kind of mad that MMO's introduced and now has kind of wrecked things for mobile.
Yeah, I mean, mobile, it's now making its way to PC and console. I mean, when you consider the number of the gacha games that the Switch is getting as a result, it's one of those cases where, I mean, as much as I hate them, the companies behind those games understand what they're trying to do. It's a case of, hey, we know how our game loop works. We know how to implement these Skinner box type designs, and companies just need to understand that all the spectacle in the world isn't going to amount to anything. I mean, a good example of a game that tried to wow us with spectacle but crashed and burned was Clive Barker's Jericho, because they thought, oh, we have Clive Barker, this massive, well-known horror
we have
writer.
the one guy who was able to make Hellraiser. Oh, that's gonna totally get us, Call of Duty money or whatever kind of money.
Yeah, and I mean, it's the same case with Daikatana, where it's like, oh, John Romero, one of the guys behind Doom, and it didn't really work.
Yeah,
and that's the thing. It's very much one of those game companies need to go back to basics and need to focus on making games that do one thing really well, and that's even if you are making an open world game, you've got to make that open world worth exploring. You've got to make the objectives and stuff you do in this open world actually worth investing in. I mean, this is the difference between something like Saints Row 4, where it kind of is almost a parody of the open box genre, as opposed to, well, Final Fight Streetwise is probably the only other example. The only example of one that
I love
did it
that
poorly.
Streetwise is an
I'm sure
example.
there's plenty of. Because, again, it's a classic case of Capcom wanting to create their own version of Grand Theft Auto without understanding what made Grand Theft Auto work. And it's the same case where they even did their whole beat-down Fist of Vengeance game that was pretty much, the exact same thing. It's very much a case of where, yeah, if you want to make an open world game, then you've got to find a way to make that open world worth exploring. Whether it's like, oh, you find this rare equipment by doing these quests, like you see in Monster Hunter, or by creating a story that's actually worth investing into, like you see with things like Stardew Valley, Rune Factory, or even to a certain extent. I know there have been examples of like open world games that aren't as focused on combat, but still draw you in based on the stories you get involved with. Yeah, I think Stardew Valley is like the only example I can think of, but
Stardew Valley, Fez would technically be, well, I hate to bring up Phil Fish here, but it is. Like, it's one of those games that encourages you that way. Another one that somebody brought to my attention was a game called Alwa's Awakening that also is kind of, it basically prides itself more as a puzzle platformer than it is about combat.
Yeah, and that's the key thing. It's a case of, rather than trying to throw in features from every major successful AAA game, you should look at how they use those features and basically find a way to make a gameplay loop that actually builds off of it. And that's something that developers just aren't willing to do. I mean, when you look at how EA has handled a company like BioWare, a game company that was known for making very story-driven role-playing games, and then basically trying to make them make an MMO, which, granted, yes, they had experience working on things like Star Wars with the Old Republic, but that's a classic example of, oh, let's take this company that's good for making single-player, story-driven experiences with really well-written characters and make them make an MMORPG and expect it to be as successful, which, granted, there was that initial hype from the Old Republic, but that slowly died off as people just went back to the MMO they were already playing.
And also another thing that took a lot of people away from it was that, remember, this was around the time that free-to-play was starting to get coined, and it did not have good connotations when it came to that term, and a lot of fans left because they'd heard that BioWare was taking the Old Republic free-to-play. And so at that point, they were worried that they were going to get pestered and that they were going to have nothing but predatory microtransactions. You want to be able to get this unique gun or lightsaber, you got to pay for it. And so that actually hurt it. Thankfully, a lot of that audience has come back now that they've kind of figured out how the subscription model and the free-to-play model should work. And I will actually say, like, as a person who has recently gone back to the Old Republic while waiting for World of Warcraft Shadowlands, they've done a good job with it, and they've actually made it non-predatory. I love it.
Yeah, but it's very much a rare exception because, again, when free-to-play started being a thing, most people thought of the Nexon stuff like MapleStory and Mabinogi, and I speak as someone who used to play Mabinogi very regularly. But then you also have cases of people shoehorning in features into established MMOs that end up basically killing the MMO, like what happened with Star Wars Galaxy, where they because with the original earlier version of Star Wars Galaxies, it actually took time for your character to become a Jedi. You actually had to go through a lot of steps before you even got the lightsaber, which worked because it's like, oh, it's kind of like how it would be in the actual galaxy, where you can't just click a button to become a Jedi. You got to train, you got to work for it. But then came the update where, oh yeah, you can just push this button and now you're a Jedi class. And then suddenly the whole game fell apart. People jumped ship because now that challenge, that investment, that basically the reward for that investment was taken away. And that's another key thing with games like that, is that you've got to make the gameplay loop design, you've got to make it so that way the player is willing to invest in that experience, willing to go through that gameplay loop, in order to actually, get that satisfying conclusion, whether it's beating a really, really hard boss in a very challenging action game, or finding this very, very obscure item drop in order to craft a special weapon or a special item. It's that kind of case of there needs to be that idea, that balance between the grind and the payoff that actually makes it worthwhile. And again, problem is the industry basically wants to have their cake and eat it too. They basically want to use stuff that's already been proven without actually taking the time to understand why it worked.
Okay. So we have two other aspects here that I want to get into, but I know that we're running out of time because Romney specifically has work the next day. But I want to make sure that we get to at least one of them. We're going to broach it because it's part of the other one, but I want to at least bring it up because it's going to get talked about. If you're going to increase the price, so I'm talking a lot about reducing the exorbitant budgets, and there's a reason for it. It's not just because I think you could get a lot of profit from it, but more because I think that something else could happen in the meantime, which is that you could add a little money to those budgets for quality assurance. Quality is a big thing when it comes to this $20 increase, and frankly, we're even seeing it on our chat. That if you're going to expect me to pay 20 more bucks, you better put a hell of a lot more quality into it than Fallout 76 got, all right? Or that Skyrim got, or any of that stuff. And it's a valid concern. Because here's the bottom line. If I'm paying 80 bucks for a game and it's buggy as hell, and I'm reviewing it, at that point, it's an instant 0 out of 10. Because at that point, if you can't even, you're asking us to spend this much more money because you want to do this exorbitant budget, and you're not even willing to go test it yourself. And I get that some people are going to make the justification of, well, we can get our fan bases to do it for us, or you can do Steam Greenlight. That's not what I'm talking about. You need to do it internally. And it's high time that the gaming industry needs to realize that they have to do it internally. And you can't just rely on, well, our fans are going to do it for us, because eventually the fans are going to get pissed. Like they did with 76. And especially when they feel that the companies are no longer listening to them. I just barely saw a big hubbub in World of Warcraft where back in the day, I know this is a foreign concept for Romney, but they used to listen to their hardcore game audience and say like, oh, well, maybe if you fix this little thing, it would actually help the overall gaming experience. And then they implement it, and it worked. But now, unfortunately, Activision Blizzard has a real problem with putting, pretentious asshats in charge of the communities. And so then they come off with a cocky, pretentious attitude in these forums, don't listen to any of the feedback that's being given by some of their most hardcore supporters. And then they wonder why their audiences are pissed at them, kind of thing. Like, why are you guys so insulting to us? Because you're not listening, kind of thing. And this is definitely something has to change in the next generation. Absolutely. And that's why it is going to be a bigger discussion topic in one of the later ones, but I'm bringing it up here at least a little bit. If you're going to ask us $20 extra, you would better be willing to deliver on quality insurance.
And honestly, this is probably the big difference between a company like Nintendo and a lot of these other companies, is because Nintendo understands the idea of, hey, let's actually test these and make sure they're working properly. There's a reason they still have the Super Mario Club that is basically their testing house. Yes. Is because they understand that. They understand, especially when designing for something that's...
Well, and correct me if I'm wrong, the Super Mario house has a pedigree to it. Like, they're good at what they do.
Yep. I mean, there's a reason why they actually take their time with their games, and that's why they don't necessarily try to rush to get the super advanced hardware, because it's a case of, okay, well, we could get these super advanced graphics and processors, but how is this going to translate to better game design? And 9 times out of 10, it doesn't. Like I keep mentioning, that so many companies focus so much on spectacle, but I guarantee you, a game, I mean, between an RPG that comes out on the Switch that is more polished, like Fire Emblem Three Houses, is going to be infinitely more interesting, even if it's not necessarily the most fanciful graphically, or may not necessarily have a lot of these bells and whistles. It'll still be a more fun game because they polished the core gameplay loop of it, as opposed to a strategy game like, well, I can't think of any major mainstream strategy games that have come out on consoles, because that's mostly a PC thing. Like XCOM was, I wouldn't necessarily equate it, because XCOM, they at least polished it. Yeah. I guess a better example would be something like something like Chrono Trigger as opposed to,
See, the most recent strategy game that I could bring up is, but I wouldn't call it a franchise. So they're experimenting with putting Transformers into it, and so at that point, like, that's interesting, but it's not a series.
Yeah, I think a better way to put it, a better example would be playing a game like Chrono Trigger, which is nice and polished. It may not be the most advanced like game of its time, but it did what it did very well, as opposed to Final Fantasy VIII, which tried to wow on spectacle, but because of a lot of questionable gameplay decisions, it's still, again, I know there are a lot of fans of Final Fantasy VIII, but compared to the rest of the series, it is arguably one of the weaker entries. Granted,
and some of the fan base will actually acknowledge it. So
yeah, I mean, a better example than 8 would be 13. Final Fantasy 13 is also a good example of a game that tried to rely solely on spectacle, and it didn't really work. It didn't meet those numbers. This is why people go back to games like Final Fantasy 6 and 7 as opposed to games. And that's another key thing, is that you don't need the major fancy graphics. You don't need the star power of Hollywood actors. You don't need some major established intellectual property like Marvel or Dungeons and Dragons. If the game is good and polished and well executed, people will play it, and then they will tell their friends about it, and then their friends will play it.
Yeah, it's not like there was a niche audience for Super Mario Brothers, all right? Super Mario Brothers came here. Nobody really knew what it was, especially the arcade entry. I actually meet a lot of people who don't even know what that original entry was. And so at that point, you didn't have the audience there, but yet they found a way to do it. It's one of those things where I'd like to bring up Field of Dreams. If you build it, they will come. And if you build it and it's good, they will come. Kind of thing.
Yeah, I mean, especially with the way gaming kind of transitioned from the arcade to consoles, a good example would be a game like Dragon Quest or Final Fantasy, where many people who bought game consoles, I mean, when you look at in Japan, Dragon Quest, they understood, the original creators of Dragon Quest, the very first one, understood, hey, this very complex RPG genre that we like that comes from the West, that's going to be a bit of a hard sell. Let's find a way to simplify it so that way Japanese gamers, get a little bit easier. Okay, the first game we just stick with the very basic one-party system, one-character system. Okay, that did well. Okay, let's introduce the idea of multiple characters in a party in the next game. And they slowly built on it because they understood, hey, we know this genre is a bit of a tough sell, and now it's one of the biggest JRPG franchises in the world. Yeah. And it's the same case with a game like Mario or a game like Pikmin. With Pikmin, that was a very risky title, but because they knew what they set out to do, they knew what they were trying to do, people played it, people liked it, and now you've got three games.
Exactly. So we pretty much hit the last. We pretty much hit this quality assurance. It needs to be something that is accounted for, and when we get more into that, it's going to be when we actually talk about what the overall gaming industry has to improve as a whole moving forward, especially into this new generation. All right. And so at that point, the last thing that I want to get into, because I think it is going to have a financial impact on the next generation, is that, okay, you want $80. There's this indie developer who wants $40, and he's put $60 worth of effort into a much easier game for him to make with a smaller team. Why should I be supporting your $80 game when I could be supporting that? And this has actually been a big question that I've gotten is, could this actually be the generation where indie overtakes AAA? I don't know about that. It's a bold claim. It could. Especially considering that it would be cheaper to just purchase indie games. And I'll be honest, and you've said it too in previous podcasts, we have been looking a lot more into indie games than we ever have. And for good reason, too. Like, you brought up Bloodstained Ritual of the Night. I've never finished that game. I've replayed it numerous times to finish it, and I still am getting my $60 worth out of it. Or I think actually $50 because of that. So, at this point, like, what is going to be the impact of indie on this new market and how much AAA is wanting us to pay? I actually think it's going to take a lot more hardcore gamers away from it. I don't think it's going to take the casual gamer away, but it is going to take a lot more of the hardcore audience, which a lot of these games rely on, because they're going to be more interested in what's happening in the indie scene than they are in the AAA. You there?
Yeah, and especially understand the kind of games they want. Yeah, like
Okay, good.
my audio thing glitched out for a bit, but yeah, one thing that a lot of these indie developers have that a lot of these AAA publishers don't so much is they understand what it's like to be a gamer on the receiving end of a bad game. They know it's a case of, hey, we know the frustration, so let's take what we know about what doesn't work and actually implement what we know works that will better align with the type of experience we're trying to offer. And again, you've got some developers that are about creating emotional, heartfelt experiences. You've got others that are more about creating something that is just more fun and casual and not meant to be taken super seriously.
Yeah.
And it also just goes back to the ideas that AAA development is losing that passion for the craft of game design. And that's something that's really missed that you see in indie developers, is that you can tell when a game had a team that was passionate about it, that really cared about the final product.
I miss that in AAA. I really do.
Yeah, Streets of Rage 4, again, the best example that's available on the most consoles is that you can tell everybody working on it were fans of the originals and wanted to do it justice, and boy, did they do it justice.
Boy, did they, yeah.
And this is coming from someone who never played any of the previous Streets of Rage games. This was my first one, and I could even tell this labor of love.
See, what's funny is, like, you've been playing it. Me and Andrea have been wanting to get into it. We just haven't found the time this year. I swear during the holiday season we're going to. But that's all I've heard, is that there was nothing but love put into that game. Nothing but love for the Streets of Rage crowd. Nothing but love for hardcore beat-em-up fans. And it shows in every aspect of that game. And that's definitely something that I think has to be considered, is that a lot of the hardcore audience is going to leave because they don't see the passion in these games anymore. Maybe they do occasionally from people like Cory Balrog, but it's not a regular thing in the AAA industry anymore. Instead, it's more expected of the indie portion of the gaming industry than anything else. And we actually did get an interesting chat suggestion on this, but what happens when the indie game companies become AAA, then they kind of start to adopt this stuff. Yes and no. Some indie developers will still adopt their own philosophies on it. Like you could argue Scott Cawthon's big at this point, but he still has a love for his audience.
I mean, a better example in terms of an actual company would be a company like WayForward, where they were a bit of a smaller studio, but they've gotten successful enough that now Shantae is kind of an established brand now. Granted, it's more still a very relatively niche, obscure brand, but they've gone from making a small little game on the Game Boy to being able to commission Studio Trigger to make an opening for their more recent game.
Exactly.
And so it's very much, it goes back to that core idea of not losing that passion as you get bigger, while also being smart about it, because that's what happened with Telltale, is that they got really big. The passion was there, but they didn't really have the know-how to keep things going, and that's why they crashed and burned as horribly as they did.
And they weren't willing to bring in the people that would have helped them with that, because they saw them as, we don't need that. And that ultimately contributed to their downfall. Whereas you have companies like, I like that you brought up WayForward. WayForward is a perfect example of this, where they've done AAA efforts as well as indie efforts, and they've been able to maintain their vision. I think another one that has been slowly slinking into people's minds is Yacht Club. Yacht Club has been able to find a way to maintain their own passion while becoming powerhouses in their own right, to the point where we're actually looking at things like Cyber Shadow basically being AA or even AAA in terms of its scope. So at that point, it's one of those deals where it just depends on the company that you're dealing with. But if the company truly has the passion, if the crew that is working together, then you won't have that problem. You won't have them adopting AAA ideals. Especially in some cases where you might actually be looking at these studios and they're, out in the middle of Nebraska somewhere, as opposed to all the coffee shops in California, kind of thing, which I think is a contributing factor to a lot of that.
Because I mean, there's even companies here in Utah that have been finding ways to establish themselves. Granted, they've had highs and lows. I know that was the case with Avalanche, which got some fair prominence by working on games for Disney, but because of the failure of Disney Infinity, I mean, I know they're still around. It's just that's what happens with any company. Sometimes an idea you invest in
didn't
works
they
well for
just
a while.
Barely announce a game?
I think so, but
I can't remember it though.
I can't remember. I just know that they are still open, and I do believe they are still working with Disney, but they did have to change a lot of their operations after Disney Infinity was shut down, because that market of the toy-based augmented gaming kind of burst where parents and gamers kind of got fed up with it, and that's why you don't see much of either Skylanders or Disney Infinity much anymore, because
No.
And so it's kind of that same case where, yeah, like any industry, there's those peaks and valleys where sometimes you're doing really well, sometimes you've got to tighten your belt a little bit and then keep powering through. I mean, people forget that, especially here in Utah, that's what we saw with companies like Maxis before EA got its grubby little hands on it.
Yeah.
With things like SimCity and The Sims and a lot of the related games that took off and became very popular because they kind of knew what they were trying to do. Again, before Electronic Arts happened.
Exactly, and yeah, we have tons of other stories with that one. The other one that comes to my mind is Sculpture Softworks. That was another one that suffered a lot when EA started moving into our market too. But yeah, so unfortunately we have run out of time because again we need to make sure that people can get to bed on time for their work shift because the holidays are a tragic thing. They are busy for everybody. So at that point, I think we've had an amazing discussion. I actually want to thank the live chat as well. They brought up also amazing points that I wish we could have gotten to all of them. But I have a feeling what I'm going to do is I'm going to take a lot of these and we're going to bring them up tomorrow when we're playing Final Fantasy 15. So me and Andrea can kind of tackle them as well. And I don't know, maybe we'll get somebody to call in. I don't know. We'll figure crap out like that. But before I wrap things up officially for the evening, I've got a buddy of ours named RPX who is asking a lot of questions of Romney. And since Romney does not have the chat up, I at least want to kind of go into these really quick. The first one is obvious because these are kind of funny too. Romney, do you dig giant robots?
Honestly, I'm actually not that big of a mecha fan. I mean, there are still some shows that I've tried to get into, like Big O and Turna Gundam, but, well, it's just I've yet to find that mecha show that really does it for me. I mean, Turna Gundam has some potential because of what it's trying to say, and Big O has the mystery element of, oh, everybody has amnesia, and that's kind of the underlying thing of what happened that gave everybody amnesia. But, yeah, I'm not as big into mecha, and I get it. I'm a Power Rangers fan, but it's not really the giant monster fights that I really
I just love the fact that basically he's referring to Megas XLR. So at that point, and that you know what, that's a series that I'd recommend to you because it just makes fun of a lot of those series, and it does it well.
Yeah, I've heard of it. People have recommended it to me, but it's again, despite appearances, I'm not that big of a mecha fan. And again, being a Power Rangers fan, people would think, oh, you like the giant Megazord fights, but it's not really the Megazord fights that really do it for me. It's the street level fights. Yeah,
exactly. The next one is, what would Romney do for a Klondike bar? This is an internal stream thing that RPX likes to bring up a lot. Because he broke me one night on Last of Us Part 2 when he brought up Klondike bars. I can't even tell you what happened there.
Well, if I answer the question, well, I'm going to invoke my Fifth Amendment rights. And
all right, there you go. That even helps out. And then the last one is, did Romney ever play a game or review a game called I Am Setsuna?
I haven't. It's been recommended to me because of the fact that it was Square trying to make RPGs the way they used to in the wake of the success of Bravely Default. It's just, I've got a huge enough backlog already with RPGs, and just given my job and being a working adult, I just don't have that kind of time to really get invested. I still need to beat Bravely Second before the release of Bravely Default 2.
Right.
And as well as Dragon Quest XI, the remake of Dragon Quest VIII, Final Fantasy VII Remake, The Witcher 3.
Funniest thing, the older you get, the bigger the backlog gets. So
yeah, not to mention also me trying to read the mountain of books that I keep buying like some sort of multimedia hoarding dragon.
Exactly. But I also did say I am actually currently working on a retro review for that. I'm just making sure that I can get out the other game that I'm working on, which is Sly Cooper. Where I do a retro review. That's been the promised first episode, is that I'm going to do a review of Sly Cooper and the Phoebius Raccoonus. And then I also have I Am Setsuna, and that works too. So we'll see what I have to say about that. But let's go and wrap things up for the evening. Unfortunately, Alex could not join us for the rest, so I'll go ahead and give his information. If you guys want to reach out to his content, you can find him on YouTube at ShadowBlazer3000, where he does anime content and actually gives his opinion a lot on more the industry these days than he does of actual anime. I kind of find that refreshing and interesting. But also, you can find him on Twitter at AlexJShort if you want to be able to ask questions about stuff we were talking about with the gaming industry, because he is a gamer. and he has valid stock in that and wants to be able to see the gaming industry succeed. So you guys can reach out to him there. Stephen Romney, how do people get a hold of you?
Well, you can find my content under my handle, Studio Ghost Utah. That is my handle on YouTube, Facebook, and SoundCloud when I actually have something to upload to SoundCloud. And if you want to see a more personal side of me, whether it's my activism, really, really angsty comics that I, for some reason, decide to put out into the world, as well as book reviews, you can also follow me on Instagram under Romney Does Art. And if you want to interact with me directly to send me stories or to otherwise get my opinion or witness very, 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 very long debates, you can follow me on Twitter at Romney Reviews. And since we've been talking about indie titles, for this week's recommendation, I'm going to recommend an indie game. It's not perfect, and it's actually something I may make a full video review in the future, but it's one that I've been having a little bit of fun with, called Shaolin vs. Wu-Tang Eastern Heroes. Now, it's basically a casual indie fighting game themed around the various martial arts films of the 1970s. So you're not going to find Hadokens or Burn Knuckles or Rising Tackles in this game.
Yeah.
It is basically a bunch of fighters based on real-world martial arts. Well, real-world in the sense of martial arts showcased in films. And, well, every fighter has the same input for all their special moves, where everything is quarter circle forward, quarter circle back. But there's this hidden layer to it where it's fun playing these characters and figuring out what moves chain together into an effective combo. And while it does have a little bit of jank, it's definitely one I would recommend for people who want a fighting game that doesn't have as steep a learning curve as the likes of Guilty Gear or Dragon Ball FighterZ. If you want something that's fun and casual, filled with references to famous martial arts movies and martial arts movie actors, you'll have a good time. It's available on Switch, PS4, Xbox One, and originally was a Steam title, and was pretty much largely developed by one guy, which is what is the most impressive thing. So that's this week's recommendation, is Shaolin vs. Wu-Tang Eastern Heroes.
And one thing that you and I specifically need to figure out is at some point, because we haven't done it in a while and we wanted to do it, but it's just because of time. If we can ever get a point where we can actually do like a fighting game stream again, we need to get you on there, because we've already gotten a lot of people asking, various opinions on, stuff that's coming out in either this year or the next one. I already know that people want it. Like if I ever do a playthrough of Black Wukong, to bring you in for it, because you're the one that first brought it up before we even got a trailer.
Yeah.
So
I mean, we still need to actually see how each of us fares with the old school stuff like Karate Champ.
Exactly. We need to do stuff like that. The other thing too that I really wanted to do, but I've not been able to get to work, is I wanted to get into the Strive beta, and that never happened. I never got the call, and that would have been a cool thing to do, because I was excited for Strive, despite some of the negative stuff that was being said this year. I at least wanted to get my hands on it, but we will definitely need to work that out and see if we can get a fighting game stream going.
We will strive to cover Strive.
Exactly. So with that being said, you guys can also reach out to me on Twitter at Drac2326, where you can ask these general questions, or you can see me go through really, 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 really long debates, as Romney, I think, is referencing. And despite that was a fun debate. Regardless, that was fun to be able to have some civil discourse and actually discuss some of the issues that are going on in the day. And I love that some people even some friends reached out to me and was like, do you really want to do this? Do you want to end this? And I was like, no, we're fine. Like, I even double checked with Romney. It's fine. Yeah. We're having fun. And I thought it was a really great way to stretch our legs and be able to actually discuss some of the things that people don't really want to talk about. So that's a really great way to be able to do it. If you guys want to be able to follow pictures of my family, fart jokes, geeky memes, I especially put one up that people were very offended about when I said things not to do at the voting poll booth. Somebody actually sent me a picture. This was legit, of somebody who pulled down their pants at a voting booth. So I shared it around and everybody's like, gross! Like, guys, for all you know, he was just playing it up.
Well, and plus, considering everything we've seen this year, it's like nothing surprises us.
Yeah, exactly.
Anymore.
Like, we're going to have flammable snow in a month. Really?
I mean, we still have the murder hornets to worry about.
Yes, we do. So at that point, yeah, I can think of a lot of other things to worry about. You guys can follow me on Instagram at Drac2326. And of course, if you guys want to support the podcast directly, the first thing that we ask you guys to do is support the RSS feed, which is geekynro.libsyn.com. And that is where all of our episodes are up. And in fact, I've actually been able to put up a couple of episodes of the G Gundam podcast for you guys to have. The first 4 episodes are up there, so you can listen to me and Andrea review Mobile Fighter G Gundam and all of its stereotypical insanity. free, because that's all it is. So you guys can enjoy that. You can also watch us live every Sunday from at 5 o'clock Eastern. We will be recording the podcast live. We can't do it on Fridays anymore. In fact, I've actually moved my Thursday stream to Friday because that works a little bit better that way for my overall schedule. So you guys can look forward to that, and you can join us live there. You can also follow us via social media on Twitter and Facebook under the exact same tagline, Geeky NRO, where we will try very hard to get you guys up-to-the-minute information on when we're going live and the stuff we're going to be talking about, and maybe even the stuff that we're not so sure about talking about, like, say, for all the people who wanted us to cover the election. You guys keep forgetting that I have a no politics rule.
Yeah, there's a reason our debate was limited to Twitter.
Exactly. Sorry. Like, as much as I probably have no problem discussing that with Romney, I would probably do it on another podcast entirely because it just doesn't work here. So at that point, you guys can get updates there for Facebook and Twitter under Geeky NRO. And of course, if you want to submit stories or submit discussion topics, as we have discussed today, you can do so at geekyweek@gmail.com. And I would implore you guys to join us next week as we're going to be talking about the entertainment industry and the changes that they're going to have to make because of COVID. One in particular that I think is going to get brought into next week, just to give you a little tidbit, as to whether or not you actually need to keep all of the entertainment action in Hollywood, and to whether or not you can actually have people live in other states to be able to do their acting jobs. So we look forward to having you guys next week for that. And, of course, it's awesome to be able to have you guys here. Thank you guys so much for your love and support. And we got to get out of here so that we can all get to sleep. So for me, for Romney, and for Alex, we will see you guys next week for more geek news, reviews, and opinions.